Cari colleghi, gentile pubblico, buongiorno e benvenuti all'Accademia Belgica. È per me un grande onore, ma anche un vero piacere poter accogliere tra le nostre mura questo convegno consacrato a Giusto di Gand. Sono onorata perché gli organizzatori hanno scelto di venire da noi per il loro primo giorno di un incontro internazionale che si prospetta interessante e innovativo, dedicato alla produzione di un pittore ancora piuttosto enigmatico che ha lavorato e nei Paesi Bassi meridionali e nel Ducato di Urbino. Heureuse aussi, car ce colloque a été organisé en partenariat scientifique entre l'Institut royal du patrimoine artistique et l'Université d'Urbino, représentés respectivement par Bart Fransen et Francesca Bottacin, que je remercie très vivement ici. Venant moi-même d'une université, celle de Bruxelles, mais aussi des musées royaux d'art et d'histoire, j'accueille donc de proches collègues dont la présence démontre encore une fois l'importance de la recherche en histoire de l'art dans nos institutions scientifiques fédérales. Une recherche fondée à la fois sur des arguments stylistiques dont on ne dira jamais assez combien ils sont fondamentaux, mais soutenue aussi par des analyses de laboratoire relatives aux pigments et à la dendrochronologie, ainsi que par le processus de la restauration. We mogen heel fier zijn over de expertise van onze onderzoekers. En ik wil natuurlijk specifiek Bart en zijn team bedanken. Het Studiecentrum voor Vlaamse Primitieven, en ik citeer u, houdt zich vast aan een onderzoek dat systematisch, rijk gedocumenteerd, interdisciplinair en beschikbaar voor een ruim publiek is. The Academia Belgica, Center for History, the Arts and Sciences, is very proud to welcome you all, coming from universities and museums, from Germany, the United Kingdom, the States, Spain, the Netherlands, and of course, Italy. This marvelous country that continues to attract scientists and artists alike, and has always shown us remarkable hospitality. I now give the floor to Bart.
Thank you very much, Cécile Evers. I wished my Italian would be as good as yours, but I will switch into English. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, it's my great pleasure and excitement to extend the warmest welcome alongside my esteemed colleague from the University of Urbino, Francesca Bottacin, to all participants here in Rome and joining us online also for this conference titled Giusto di Gand, Reconsidered, an international symposium presenting new research on his attributed oeuvre. A special welcome also to Laurence de Wolf, Deputy General Representative of the Government of Flanders, to Kathleen de Nijs, First Secretary of the Belgian Embassy, and to Massimiliano Carreto, Director of one of the most important art galleries for Flemish art in Italy. In 2021, amid the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic, we initiated a series of online meetings with a small international coalition comprising art historians, conservators, and scientists. The purpose was to share our recent findings on works attributed to Giusto di Gand and his circle. At the time, we never anticipated convening in Italy together. However, throughout the 6 online meetings, the idea was occasionally raised by one scholar or another. Shouldn't we leave our screens and discuss our research findings in Italy in front of Giusto's key works? And gradually, this idea evolved into a plan. And now, 3 years later, we found ourselves here in Rome, en route to Urbino, exactly like Joos van Wassenhove did nearly 550 years ago. Francesca Bottacin and me took the initiative to organize this symposium and to develop a program, and we are delighted to have so many renowned scholars have accepted our invitation. But when aiming to turn your dreams into reality, you cannot accomplish everything alone. You need support from others. And for a bottom-up project like this one, we are very pleased to have found that support. We want to express our thanks, first of all, to our own institutions, the Università, degli Studi di Urbino and the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage, but also all the partners who supported the symposium in various capacities. The Accademia Belgica here in Rome for receiving us, the Galleria Nazionale delle Marche in Urbino, the Confraternita del Corpus Domini, the Oratorio di San Giovanni, the Unione Internazionale degli Istituti di Archeologia, Storia e Storia dell'Arte. I hope pronunciation was correct. The research group in arts, digital humanities and art sources for Urbino Renaissance, and finally also Brebels Publishers. Above all, we express our sincere gratitude to the institutions whose logos are displayed at the bottom of the booklet, but whose general financial support made this symposium possible. Therefore, special thanks are due to the Flemish government and their representation here in Italy, whose support was crucial for the symposium, to the art gallery Carretto and Ochinegro for sponsoring this scholarly symposium on Giusto di Gand, to the Belgian Federal Science Policy, BELSPO, and to the municipality of Urbino for their contribution. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Laurence de Wolf, Deputy General Representative of Flanders in Rome, and I'm very delighted that you will be with us, not just for the speech, but also for the coming next days, along with your colleague, Hélène Rijsleg. Ms. de Wolf, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests. So my name is Laurence de Wolf. I'm the Deputy Diplomatic Representative of the Government of Flanders, based here in Rome. And I feel very honored to celebrate with you today the remarkable legacy of Joos van Gand, who, as you well know, was a prominent Flemish painter of the 15th century. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the director of the Accademia Belgica, Cecile Evers, for supporting and partnering in this event. The Accademia Belgica is a tangible symbol of our deep cultural and academic ties with Italy. I also wish to express my sincere appreciation to Professor Francesca Bottacin and to Professor Bart Fransen for making this extraordinary event possible. Your efforts and dedication have brought together so many partners from around the world to discuss the work of Joos van Gand. And it's quite motivational to see how the academic community has gathered after a period of COVID to finally share its discoveries and foster invaluable exchanges around scientific data and findings on iconic works attributed to the Flemish master. As a representative of the government of Flanders in Italy, I'm very happy to support this academic symposium on Flemish heritage in Italy. And I feel privileged to share with you the excellence of our Flemish arts through the work of Joos van Gand, highlighting the profound historic bonds between our region and Italy. Today, Italy and the government of Flanders collaborate in various domains, ranging from culture to economic investments and exports, but academic research, digitalization and innovation, environment and infrastructure, and so on, in areas where Flanders has expertise and competencies. Not only are we active in Italy, but the government of Flanders is present in numerous countries across the European Union, the UK, Southern Africa, and the United States, where we remain keen on supporting initiatives of this nature. We keep, of course, a strong focus on the European Union and the European Union member states. And in the pivotal year of the Belgian presidency of the Council of the European Union, Flanders shines as a beacon of excellence and dynamism. Connectivity, resilience, and innovation, serving as the guiding principles of our region. Flanders is known for its strong tradition of expertise and scientific research. This expertise is supported by a network of universities, research institutions, and private companies collaborating to promote innovation among various sectors and disciplines, like here today. Flanders, with its rich cultural history, has always been at the forefront of creativity. In the 15th century, the Flemish masters revolutionized European art with their meticulous craftsmanship. Joos van Gand was one of these trailblazing artists. His journey to Italy wasn't just a physical one. It was a cultural exchange that fostered a spark of creativity on both sides. As Joos van Gand shared his knowledge, innovative imagery, and techniques with Italian artists, he also brought back fresh inspiration to Flanders, enriching our landscape with new ideas and perspectives. And as we gather to delve into the mysteries of Joos van Gand's masterpieces, we're not only celebrating the past, we're also shaping the future. The Flemish government holds in high regard our role of facilitating a platform for the exchange of ideas and dialogue among national and international experts, reaffirming Flanders as a center of expertise and a hub of creativity, innovation, and collaboration. We continue to celebrate contemporary Flemish masters, for example, at the Biennale Arte in Venice this year, with, among many others, Berlin de Breker's Angels in collaboration with the Fondazione Cini. Together with our Italian partners, we're forging new paths of discovery, exploring the intersection of art, science, and society. Because through shared knowledge, we're building bridges between cultures, leading to mutual understanding and paving the way for a more open and inclusive society. I wish you all an enriching and inspiring 3 days conference filled with fruitful exchanges, and I myself am very eager to embark on this journey together with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Massimiliano Caretto. We were introduced through Til Holger Borchert, and we are grateful for your support of this event, as well as for the beautiful catalog that many of you will find in the conference bag. Please, the floor is yours.
Dear all, it's a real honor and a huge pleasure to be here with you today, representing our gallery, Caretto Ochinegro. Last year, when Til Holger Borchert first mentioned this project to us, and we want to thank him for that, we were immediately excited about the possibility of getting involved as a sponsor. Before we knew it, we were on the same enthusiastic feeling as Bart Fransen and Francesca Bottacin, who deserve a big round of compliment for putting together such an important event. The ancient Flemish painting, which we love just as much as you do, has a special relationship with Italy, perhaps unique in the history of art. As Italian art dealers specializing in this particular school, and we are in fact the only one, the organization of a symposium dedicated to Giusto di Gand, as he is known in Italian sources, is a major event for us. To be part as patron is a way for us to show our support for research in this field and to promote the appreciation of Flemish painting in Italy. So I encourage all of you, scholars, but above all, enthusiasts of the subject like you all are, to feel free to get in touch with us for any project, study, or sharing of information. Our doors are always open. I wish you all the best for a productive and enlightening symposium. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cécile, Laurence, and Massimiliano for these opening speeches. Now it's time to take off and to dive into art history. And it's my pleasure now to leave you in the hands of my partner in crime for this symposium, Francesca Bottacin. Without any doubt, she is the foremost expert on the Communion of the Apostles, on which she recently dedicated a beautiful and fascinating monographic book. And I'm sure that without her determination and perseverance, this symposium would never have come to fruition. The impressive program and also the side activities, as will become clear in the coming days, are thanks to her. It has been a particular pleasure to collaborate with you, and I'm delighted to pass the floor to you to chair the first session of this symposium. Francesca.
Thank you, Bart. Thank you so much. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, friends, colleagues, and dear students. I'm so happy, honored, and proud to be here today in such a wonderful place, so full of culture and of the history of the relationship between our two beloved countries, Belgium and Italy, a subject which I have dedicated most of my studies and most of my life to. And I am extremely grateful to all our Belgian and Italian partners who have made all this possible. In such difficult time as this, it is such a privilege to be here talking about art, an international language from the very beginning, a language that speaks of beauty, which is good for both art and soul, a language that must be a strong message leading to peace, a language to be shared, to build bridges, not walls, between people. I come from a family that's a melting pot, a typical product of Venice and its republic, which mixed nations and cities, Greece with Austria, Padua and Trieste, and then Urbino for me. We had the chance to travel a lot and live in Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, and then Africa, the United States, and Russia. I'm European, and I'm firmly pro-Europe. And I do believe in the importance of one's national culture. But at the same time, I think that some of the most wonderful things are created by mixing different cultures and different experiences. The magnificent court of Duke Federico da Montefeltro was one of the brightest examples of this mix. The alchemy he created with his soul brother, Ottaviano Baldini della Carda, and his precious wife, Battista Sforza, generated Urbino, a palace in the shape of a city, as Baldassar Castiglione stated. This very modern Renaissance trio and the fruitful exchange of ideas between artists, scholars, and scientists created masterpieces like our Communion of the Apostles. For these very reasons, I'm so happy to have here people of different countries, experiences, and skills. And for reaching the alchemy of this symposium, I have to thank, first of all, my colleague, now friend, Bart Fransen. He made the best of a horrible period like the COVID pandemic. And he wasn't afraid to think big and brought together many colleagues that are here today with the purpose of studying Giusto di Gand. But, where is Mari? I quadri vanno visti. Paintings must be seen, Francesca. It's one of the first teachings, quite a mantra, of my maestra Caterina Limentani Virdis, an apparently very simple, almost banal teaching, but it is not. Theories are still formulated by trusting bibliography of critics who 100 years ago, often without seeing the paintings and surely without proper instruments, relied on black and white photographs. On this simple principle, we based our convention, excited at the idea that our communion that turned 550 this year will finally be seen by the most of you for the first time. Since, therefore, we believe in a multidisciplinary approach, we call art historians, scientists, and restorers. Having an eye on painting is fundamental. So are documents and literary sources, but we have also magnificent tools provided by the modern science. Here we have everything, the authority of science and the authority of experts. The aim is to know the best in order to better understand and conserve, pour mieux préserver. I have a strongly ethical and civil vision of art history that is meant to avoid the degradation which many works of art are suffering from, and our painting is no exception. So we hope to have a great debate because, as Leonard Bernstein said, a work of art doesn't answer questions, it provokes them. Sometimes we all say things just to prove ourselves right. We take bibliography for granted for gospel. We don't listen to other voices. We don't want to change our minds. Someone suggested to me to call it a kind of bibliographic imprinting. I think it's nice. But I ask you to listen to other people's ideas and to be open to the possibility of changing minds, remembering that the question is often more important than the answer, and sometimes it's better to express doubts than certainties. To conclude, I can't help to notice this similarity of situations, quite moving for me. I was a young graduate, not yet on my PhD, when I helped in the Rubens Symposium held in Padua in 1990, as big and international as this one. I had the chance to meet extraordinary art historians like Michael Jaffe, Konrad Renger, and Emil Reznicek. And now I see all these young curators and PhD students attending the conference, and they will soon listen to as many experts and luminaries. Therefore, I'm addressing young people, thanking especially my former students and our intern who are helping us in the symposium. So Veronica, Alessandro, and Nina. I wish you the same luck I had in my working life, to live it with curiosity, intellectual honesty, but above all, passion and love. Thank you. So finally, let's get started, shall we? So, wait. I need my other. Okay. So she's the one of the most brilliant and skilled scholars specialized in artistic exchange between the Burgundian Netherlands and Italy, author of the wonderful books like From Flanders to Florence by Yale 2004. She has consulted on related exhibitions, including Firenze gli antichi Paesi Bassi with my dear friend Bert Meyer, for many years director of the Dutch Institute in Florence, and then Memling in Rome, and then Van Eyck in Ghent. She's currently working on the patrons of Michelangelo Bruges Madonna. She was late medieval and early Renaissance course director at the Victoria and Albert Academy and an associate lecturer at the Courtauld. We thought she was the best to introduce us in Giusto's world. So, ladies and gentlemen, speaking on the enigma and phenomenon of Giusto da Guanto, Paula Nuttall.
Thank you, Francesca, for that lovely welcome, and thank you for inviting me. I have to say, at a certain point when I was working on this paper, I thought, why have I taken this on? Because it was, it's quite a problematic thing, is Justice of Gand, as we all know, and that's why we're here. And before I do anything else, please may I have a glass of water, just in case? Thank you. And, oh, also, please can somebody just give me a, is this the thing for the slides? Thank you, thank you. Justice of Ghent is an enigma. His identity is uncertain. Justice, Giusto, may not have been his given name. His oeuvre is surely one of the most problematic in the history of art. It isn't large and is universally in severely compromised condition. Over the past 100 years, his authorship of every work once attributed to him has been questioned, contested, and in many cases denied, even those that are documented or authenticated by early sources, an issue that has come to divide the scholarship, sometimes bitterly. This debate has become a distraction from other equally pertinent questions. What, for instance, might have been the impact of an experienced Netherlandish master working in a small but culturally significant centre in 15th century Italy, a phenomenon unique to Urbino? How might he have operated and adapted to local practices? And how might this cultural milieu have impacted on him? My intention in this introductory talk is not to resolve, but to revisit the justice problem and focusing on the Italian works to raise questions which can form a basis for discussion, not only in the coming days, but moving forwards. It's worth noting that much of the debate rests on scientific research that is now relatively old. Jacques Lavalle's on the works at Urbino in the 1960s, Nicole Reynaud and Claudie Ressor's on the Louvre famous men, undertaken during their restoration in 1984 to 89, and Lorne Campbell's publications on the paintings at Hampton Court and the National Gallery, respectively investigated in 1979 to 80 and 1993. These studies have been crucial to our understanding of the oeuvre, but more recent investigations of the Italian works, notably by teams in France and Italy, but also in the UK, are yielding more nuanced results that may lead us to revise our views. But to begin with the documentary evidence. Mastro Giusto da Guanto de Pittore is recorded in payments between 12th February 1473 and 25th October 1474 by the Confraternity of Corpus Domini at Urbino for their altarpiece, the Communion of the Apostles. The first, for wine, probably relates to the signing of the contract. The last records that the painter had been paid in full, but enigmatically adds non fece al dovere, a point we'll come back to. In early 1482, Vespasiano da Bisticci, the knowledgeable and well-connected Florentine bookseller, visited Urbino, where he was shown around the ducal library by Federico da Montefeltro himself. Vespasiano had been providing books for the library for many years and was therefore well qualified to comment on Federico's tastes. In his Life of the Duke, written between 1482 and 1498, Vespasiano famously relates that Federico, quote, had an excellent understanding of painting, and not finding in Italy suitable masters who knew how to paint in oil on panel, he sent to Flanders to find an eminent master and had him come to Urbino. End of quote. Vespasiano goes on to mention the famous men in the studiolo and a portrait of the Duke. Vespasiano does not name the eminent master from Flanders, but since Crowe and Cavalcaselle first made the connection, no one has doubted that he was Giusto da Gand, recorded in the accounts of the Corpus Domini between 1473 and 1475. The studiolo was completed in 1476, the date on its frieze. Giusto is usually identified with the Ghent painter Joos van Wassenhove, last documented at Ghent in 1468, and who in 1475 was said to have gone to Rome some years earlier. I have to stress that although it's nice to think that Justus Joos may well have been in Rome, it is simply based on a document written in Ghent in 1475. Whether he actually made it to Rome, we do not know. Joos, Iodocus in Latin, is a name that has no Italian equivalent. Giusto, justice, was used instead, as in Genoa, where in 1451, the German painter Jos Amann was known as Giusto. We have no secure basis for Giusto Jos's style before his first recorded works, the Communion and the Famous Men. Vasari notes in the Lives that Giusto da Gand painted the Communion and, quote, many other pictures, unquote. Vasari visited Urbino in 1548, just within living memory of Federico and Giusto, and his source was presumably oral. Many subsequent writers continued to associate these works with Giusto, but by the early 17th century, an alternative tradition had arisen, associating them with a Spanish painter. In 1604, the Cordoban artist Pablo de Céspedes, who had spent many years in Italy and could have visited Urbino, in his discourse on painting, mentions the Castilian Pedro Berruguete, followed by, quote, another Spanish painter, unquote, who was the author of the famous Men at Urbino. In 1632, the French bibliophile Gabriel Naudet visited Urbino and had the Communion copied in a sketch which he annotated, not entirely accurately. He misidentifies certain figures in the painting. Since its discovery in 1997 by Vladimir Uren, attention has focused on its inscription, Petrus Hispanus Pinxit, which may record a now lost signature, or perhaps more likely, oral tradition. The Spanish connection may reflect a cultural shift at Urbino, where by the 17th century, Duke Francesco Maria II had close ties with Spain. This tradition nevertheless had its roots in fact. In 2001, Fernando Marias and Felipe Pereda discovered a document dated 15th of April, 1477, concerning an assault by a member of the Corpus Domini on one Magister Petrus Spaniolus Pictor, resident in the ducal palace. This document, long considered lost, had been known to the scholar Luigi Pungi Leoni in 1822, and in the 1920s led Roberto Longhi, Juan Allende Salazar, and Carlo Gamba to identify Pietro Spaniolo as the Castilian painter Pedro Berruguete. Seeing elements in Berruguete's later Castilian work that suggested knowledge of the famous men and Urbinate visual culture, including famously this door case up here, which is vaguely reminiscent of entablatures over doors in Urbino, although you never actually see FC and then DX. This is a sort of misunderstanding, I think, of the inscriptions of Federico's abbreviated titles. But seeing these elements in Berruguete's later Castilian works, these scholars claimed that he had worked in Urbino in his youth. Their suggestion was accepted in many quarters. There's no scope here to go into the arguments which have been rehearsed exhaustively elsewhere and on which there may never be agreement. Suffice it to say that over the years, every work originally in Giusto's oeuvre has been reassigned to Berruguete, whose purported authorship of some of the famous men and the entirety of the portrait of Federico and Guidobaldo, the Hampton Court Discourse, and the liberal arts is often treated as documented fact. This theory gained endorsement after Renaud Rousseau found that many of the Louvre famous men had been extensively reworked by a second artist, whom they identified as Berruguete. The discovery of Naudet's sketch, inscribed Petrus Spaniolus Pinxit, led to speculation that he also completed the Communion. The words non fece al dovere in the final payment of 1474, suggesting to some that that Giusto had left it unfinished, although there is no mention of Petrus Spaniolus in the confraternity's accounts. Ironically, it was the 2003 Berruguete exhibition at Paredes de Nava that prompted some serious questioning of the Spaniards' presence and interventions at Urbino, not least because scientific analysis undertaken on his Castilian works, datable between 1488 and his death in 1503, revealed his underdrawing and painting technique to be utterly different from the Urbino paintings. The apparent connection between Berruguete and a relatively limited number of Urbinate works could be explained by the travels of Castilian painters in Italy, or by their presence in Provence, itself a nexus of Netherlandish Hispanic artistic exchange that has been the subject of recent studies. Giusto is last recorded on the 23rd of November 1475, when the Corpus Domini purchased canvas for a banner, quote, that he was to make at his own expense, unquote, possibly identifiable with the large Christ blessing now in the Cadoro. His absence from the record after 1475 doesn't necessarily mean that he had died or left Urbino. It has been suggested that he was the magister, the quote, magister justus de Alamania, resident in Urbino, who made a will and died in September 1477. But this individual is now known to have been an embroiderer. Meanwhile, the enigmatic Pietro Spaniolo, whose identification with Berruguete is now increasingly questioned, was certainly resident at Urbino and a member of the ducal household in April 1477. Cecil Clough noted that Spaniolo was the surname of an Italian family, several of whom were court functionaries at Urbino, although none are known to have been painters. Whatever his origin, Pietro was probably a member of Justice's workshop. Various Italian painters have also been discussed in connection with the workshop, most plausibly Giovanni Santi, although this question too remains an enigma. Rather than speculating on the personnel, however, let's consider how Justice's workshop may have functioned, looking at the works themselves, which for clarity I call the Justice Group. In addition to the Communion, these are the famous men. Begun before August 1474 when they were modified to include Federico's newly awarded ducal title and the orders of the Garter and the Ermine, and completed by 1476. The double portrait of Federico and Guidobaldo, and Federico and Guidobaldo listening to a discourse, respectively painted around 1476 and 1480, judging from the age of Guidobaldo, who was born in 1472. The former has been suggested by Machteld Israels to have been above the entrance to the studiolo at Urbino. The latter was perhaps above the door inside the studiolo at Gubbio. Finally, rhetoric and music from a series of the liberal arts, of which two further panels, grammar and astronomy, were destroyed in Berlin in World War II, but are known from photographs. The other three lost without record. The series may originally have comprised 2 or 3 large panels, and from their inscriptions, which include Federico's ducal title, they must date from after 1474. It is often claimed that they were made for the studiolo at Gubbio, but as Campbell has shown, it is seemingly impossible to accommodate them within that space in a way that their design, dimensions, lighting, and inscription make sense. They do not appear to have been among the paintings in the palace at Urbino, and were perhaps made for another of Federico's residences, such as Castel Durante or Fossombrone. It's important to stress that none of these works are in good condition, due in part to their later history. All are large panel paintings, many of them so heavy as to necessitate the insertion of iron fixings into the supports to take their weight on the wall. Beginning in the 17th century, they have undergone several moves, never ideal for large panels, and have been restored at various times. The famous men, which originally comprised 7 huge panels, each measuring some 240 by 170 centimeters, were taken to Rome on the death of the last Duke, Francesco Maria II, in 1631 by Cardinal Antonio Barberini, together with the double portrait of Federico and Guidobaldo. At a later unknown date, the famous men were sawn into 28 independent portraits, which in 1812 were separated into 2 sets. One set eventually entered the Campana collection and passed to the Louvre in 1862. The other remained in the Barberini collection, was bought by the Italian state in 1935, and returned to Urbino in 1983. Together with the double portrait. Rhetoric and music and the discourse, the latter slightly cut on the left-hand side, turned up in Florence in the mid-19th century. They were possibly sent with many other paintings as part of the dowry or inheritance of Vittoria della Rovere, Francesco Maria's granddaughter, who married Ferdinando II de' Medici in 1634. Although the Communion remained in Urbino, it was moved from its original home in the oratory of Corpus Domini to 4 different locations in the city between 1725 and 1883. In 1930, it travelled to Antwerp for the International Exhibition of Colonial, Maritime and Flemish Art. Severely damaged in transport, it underwent a disastrous restoration on its return to Urbino, which robbed it of much of its upper paint layer. Even without being manhandled on 17th century roads, cut and clumsily restored, from the outset, these paintings did not have a good prognosis as physical objects. Justus was unfamiliar with painting on poplar, and as Lavallee pointed out, the gesso ground of the Communion and Famous Men is of a thinness insufficient to cover the irregularities of the poplar panels, being more suited to fine-grained Baltic oak. Rhetoric, music, and the discourse have thick gesso layers, suggesting that whoever applied them was familiar with preparing poplar, but paint samples indicate that the gesso was rather rich in glue binder, probably not helpful for their condition in the long term. In all the works, the paint layers are characterized by extensive cracks and islands where the paint has contracted. These defects could be caused by insufficient drying time before applying subsequent layers, or from applying the paint rather thickly, especially when rich in binding medium, as would have been, for example, in Red Lake glazes. Or the oils may have been poorly prepared, perhaps compounded by inexpert paint preparation. They are shortcomings suggestive of a busy workshop seeking to produce works in a Netherlandish oil technique, but hampered to varying extents by the requirements of speed and a lack of expertise in the preparation of oils and the application of colour. Justus is unlikely to have prepared the oils and pigments himself and would have had to instruct a workforce unfamiliar with Netherlandish practice, not only in their preparation, but also in their application, with results that were at times less than perfect. He may also have had to cut corners in order to meet deadlines imposed by a patron who desired large decorative cycles painted in oil, but who may not have understood that oil takes longer to dry than tempera or fresco. It is sometimes claimed that Justus was hampered by having to paint by having to paint on a large scale. This is nonsense. The idea that early Netherlandish paintings were typically small is the accident of survival. Netherlandish painters were perfectly able to produce large panel paintings, the Portinari triptych being an obvious example. The workshop was organized to cope with the scale and quantity of production, with tasks distributed to maximize speed and efficiency. New IRRs of the Louvre panels reveal 3 types or groups of underdrawing, with some drawn freehand and others revealing incised contours, indicating that tracings were used to transfer the designs. Kind of hard to see from this slide because the images are quite small, but the first group is the freehand group. The other 2 involve incisions used in transferring, as I say, transferring the designs via tracings. There's also a variation in quality in the underdrawings. The authors of this research note that this could suggest that Justus was aided by assistants at the underdrawing stage. In music, rhetoric, and the discourse, the condition of the paint and the thick layers of varnish inhibits infrared penetration, making it difficult to interpret their underdrawings. Unpublished IRRs of the allegories made in 2009, slightly more legible than those made in 1993, reveal some new details and more extensive changes than previously thought. Rhetoric's dress was originally patterned, and I know this is very difficult to see in the best of circumstances, but you can perhaps just make out the brocade patterning here. Her shoulders seem originally to have been slightly higher, her head more upright, and she wore a large headdress. So shoulders originally up here, and this would have been the angle of her head with this large sort of headdress upon it. IRR indicates that both works have been extensively retouched, but there is much original paint underneath, not all of it totally obscured by later retouchings. Most of it is, more of it is just about visible, for example, in the steps and the man's tunic in music, recognizable by the stronger impasto texture. And I'm indebted to Rachel Billinge and Marika Spring of the National Gallery Scientific Department for these observations. In both works, the impression is of paint applied very quickly, with little evidence of a complicated layer structure. Despite the drying defects, they reveal a sophisticated understanding of the oil technique, evident from the different types of oil used in the preparation of the paints. In music, untreated linseed oil was used for the opaque green paint of the textile on the steps, and heat-bodied linseed oil, which dries more quickly, for the green glazes. Walnut oil, which is less yellowing, was used for the man's white sleeve. Seemingly, this was a workshop in which assistants played a considerable part in the painting process, although in the current state of knowledge, it seems unwise to attempt to assign hands. Reynaud and Ressort believed that the famous men were extensively reworked by a second artist, reinforcing the idea to them that justice was no longer on the scene. Notable variations in the handling are evident even to the naked eye. For instance, between the drapery of Bessarion, with its smooth finish and typically Netherlandish hook-ended folds, presumably by Justus, and that of Aristotle, more fluid and gestural, with rounder, more volumetric folds. New research, however, suggests that the idea of two separate campaigns may be too restrictive, and that assistants could have worked alongside Justus on the famous men. Moreover, as Michel Menu and his collaborators have noted, some of the repainting of the famous men may be the result of interventions necessitated by damage when the panels were moved to Rome in 1631, when they may have been reworked in a manner more commensurate with contemporary taste. It has been claimed that Berruguete/Pietro Spagnolo worked with or took over from Justus, partly on the basis that the technique and style of the reworked famous men and the later paintings are not typically Netherlandish. Yet, given the circumstances in which they were made, it would be surprising if they were typical. Adapting to the working environment at Urbino with Italian and or Spanish assistants and catering to the demands of his Italian patron, Justus's style and technique would surely have evolved, possibly quite rapidly. The viscous impasto paint could suggest a workshop under the aegis of an experienced Netherlandish master pushing the medium in new directions in order to speed up the painting process in these large works. This type of handling is reminiscent of early experiments in oil painting by Italian painters such as Pollaiolo and Giovanni Bellini, often also working rapidly on a large scale and, like Justus, exploiting the handling properties of the medium. Scientific evidence can shed light on some of the painting processes used by Giusto and his workshop. The Comunione has a thin, oil-bound priming on the gesso, as is typical of a Northern European oil technique, also found in many of the famous men. For painting, as we have seen, different oils were used for particular colours and layers in the Justus group, certainly in the London paintings. The pigments in the group are standard ones, applied using a mostly simple layer structure. Analysis of the Comunione indicates that the chromatic range and colour combinations employed by Giusto must originally have been very striking. They may be reflected in works by Giovanni Santi, such as The Visitation and Tobias and the Angel, which have an unusually varied palette. A very interesting discovery is the presence of colourless powdered glass in the Comunione and music. Oh, I'm so sorry, we've got the wrong slide up here. let's not worry, which colourless powdered glass used by Netherlandish painters from at least Van Eyck onwards to improve the drying and handling properties of oil paint. Its use in Giusto's workshop perhaps explains why Santi and Raphael were among the first Italian painters to exploit it extensively. Guido Baldo's portrait in the Discourse is painted on a piece of metal foil glued to the panel, a technique not uncommon in Netherlandish painting, but unique in a painting produced outside the Netherlands. Often overlooked, this is a significant piece of evidence in the case for Giusto's continued presence in Urbino. Giusto's workshop was a crucible for Netherlandish oil painting in Urbino. In turn, he cannot have been impervious to the experience of working with Italian artists. From a purely technical point of view, the practice of transferring cartoons by tracing with a blind stylus indicates a response to Italian practice. Renaissance architectural elements are a feature of the Justus group and have been attributed to the intervention of Italian artists such as the young Bramante, whose activity in these years is, however, completely speculative, or Francesco di Giorgio, documented at Urbino from May 1477. The situation may have been more nuanced, however. Justus was interested in architecture, as is evident from the ambitious church setting of the Communion. The contemporary Italian architecture and decorative features in works such as the liberal arts could reflect a response to the stimulus of working at the ducal palace, still under construction, both inside and out, in the 1470s. The design of architectural details, fixtures, and fittings must have been a topic of discussion among the artists employed there. Rather than seeing Justus as an outsider, locked into a foreign way of working, looking, and thinking, we should imagine him responding to the novelties of the artistic environment in Urbino, interacting and collaborating with Federico's other artists. It should not therefore surprise us if his figures and settings become more Italianate, particularly if we consider that Federico admired Netherlandish technique, but not necessarily Netherlandish style. Nor should it surprise us if Federico, who had a very clear visual agenda, demanded collaborations between his artists on particular projects. This would explain the hybrid character of the liberal arts, in which Italian space and form meld with Netherlandish light and texture. Federico may have wanted a pictorial scheme that would reflect his triple passions, architecture, perspective, and oil painting, and showcase the specialist skills of the artists who graced his court. The ambitious scenography, with full-length figures viewed steeply from below in a space that appears to continue across all the panels and to be part of the viewer's space, could well have been the brainchild of Francesco di Giorgio. Its realization, however, was surely left to Justus's workshop. The perspective is approximate. Orthogonals appear to converge, but do not meet in a single vanishing point. There are some awkward junctures, and the architectural vocabulary of the thrones is eclectic. The foreshortened limbs, draperies, and objects that break the fourth wall were ideas familiar to Justus from the Ghent altarpiece. But it may be that the perspectival intarsias in the studiolo could have spurred his interest in foreshortenings and di sotto in su. An Italian artist may have provided a drawing for the dazzlingly foreshortened portative organ in music, similar to ones in intarsias at Urbino, notably on the door of the liberal arts in the audience chamber, designed by Francesco di Giorgio. I'm sorry, that was the best slide I could find. I'll take a better photograph when we're going around the palace on Wednesday. Conversely, in a spirit of playful rivalry between workshops, the intarsia helmet in the Urbino studiolo was very likely inspired by its gleaming painted counterpart in the double portrait. From Crowe and Cavalcaselle onwards, one of the stumbling blocks in accepting Justus's authorship of the group has been the view that a Netherlandish painter could not have developed in this way or so quickly. An argument which, for that matter, could also apply to a Spanish painter. But why not, given the particular circumstances in which he found himself? Why should Justus not have responded to new stimuli in Urbino, just as Jean Fouquet did earlier in Rome? And if not Justus, then who was the talented painter, proficient in the Netherlandish oil technique, who produced these works? Is it any more likely that an enigmatic and unidentifiable Spaniard or Italian was their author? Ultimately, we have to make up our own minds, but rather than assume that Justus was not their author, like the jury in a court of law, we should assume that he was, until proved otherwise, beyond reasonable doubt. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was so interesting. I'm already starting to change my mind. So I forgot to say that there is a slight change of the program today because we've lost a Dutch, nearly German guy. Eric Eising is apologized because he's busy with Franz Hall's exhibition in the Gemäldegalerie Gallery in Berlin, and so she couldn't make it to Rome. But we gained a Flemish lady at the end of the afternoon, speaking after Bart Fransen and Dominique Deneuve. Thank you for accepting. So, he's professor of medieval history at the University of Urbino. He was president and still in the committee of the Unione Internazionale degli Istituti di Archeologia, Storia e Storia dell'Arte in Rome. He was secretary-treasurer of the National Committee for the celebration of the 600th anniversary of the birth of Federico da Montefeltro, and on him he has recently published Le lettere di Federico alla comunità di San Marino and Le carte di Federico. That was also a beautiful exhibition in Urbino with Marcella Peruzzi. He has more than 250 publications, most of them translated into English, French, and other languages. And now I'm going to read all the titles, okay? No, I'm kidding, can't help. Now, I would like to recall the man who believed he was King of France and the militant Middle Ages. As you understand, well, he's one of the most brilliant historians we have in Urbino and in Italy, and I'm glad that I can count him between my dearest friends. So, ladies and gentlemen, speaking on the court of Federico da Montefeltro, history and historiography, Tommaso di Carpegna.
It's hot. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all. I thank Francesca Bottacin and Bart Fransen for planning and organizing this important conference. I also bring you greetings from the Unione Internazionale degli Istituti di Archeologia, Storia e Storia dell'Arte in Roma. which began helping to organize this conference when I was president, and which I represent today. I am not an art historian, but I have been somewhat involved in the history of the Counts of Montefeltro and Dukes of Urbino. My task is so to give a brief introduction to the history and historiography of the Urbino court in Federico's time. I divide this presentation into two parts: a description longer of the main sources on the court of Urbino, and an exposition shorter of some of the more recent studies, partly connected with the celebrations for the 600th anniversary of the birth of Federico da Montefeltro. In the proceedings, I will also add an intermediate and connecting part with some reflections on the historiography of the 19th and 20th centuries. So first, sources. In the introduction to a source from the late 15th century, we read these words: "The Montefeltro court at Urbino remains one of the most celebrated and studied of the Italian and European Renaissance. The court began to take shape under the rule of Count Antonio, 1348-1404, the first real monarch after centuries in which the lineage had functioned as a concert group. It, the court, assumed greater importance under the rule of Guidantonio, 1378-1443, and reached its zenith under the governments of Federico and Guidobaldo, so 1422 until 1508. In particular, I will briefly introduce the court of Federico. As is known, the most famous work describing the court of Urbino is Il Cortegiano, the courtier, by the Mantuan Baldassare Castiglione, which presents Guidobaldo's court through his recollection of the conversations held around Duchess Elisabetta Gonzaga. Although published only in 1528 and written at the time of Duke Francesco Maria I, the work passes on the memory of a golden period corresponding to the early 16th century. The courtier also weaves a commendation of Federico and his palace, and so it is from his celebrated words that I will begin. Among his other praiseworthy deeds, he built on the rugged side of Urbino a palace regarded by many as the most beautiful to be found in all Italy, and he so well furnished it with everything suitable that it seemed not a palace but a city in the form of a palace. It was appropriate to begin with the courtier, as it is simply not possible to think of the court of Urbino without Federico's palace and without these words of Baldassare Castiglione. However, in Castiglione's work, Federico's court is not described. The source is not coeval, and the interpretive filter is strong. Incidentally, as I said, it is also so in describing Guidobaldo's court, for the courtier is laden with regret of a shining age gone. Having thus paid homage to the courtier, it is obligatory to place this text side by side with the main accounts written in Federico's time. Some authors close to Federico are not at all concerned with describing cultural aspects. I am thinking in particular of Ser Guerriero Campioni and Pier Antonio Paltroni, who show Federico primarily as a commander. In general, however, descriptions of what was done at court and who was part of the court in various capacities are found in a great many texts, some of which were written by courtiers themselves. These were masters, pedagogues, artists, philosophers, biographers, etc. Remember Giovanni Santi, Martino Filetico, Francesco Filelfo, Porcellio Pandoni, Giovanni Antonio Campano, Francesco Di Giorgio Martini, and also Angelo Galdi, Naldo Naldi, Ludovico Dasio. Outside the court, here are such great names as that of Pius II. But I do not wish to fatigue you with a list of names, which is useless and tedious. To get a general idea of this topic, I can at the moment refer you to an article by Riccardo Scrivano from 1986, an article by Heinz Hofmann from 2008, and a specific chapter of Röck and Tönnesmann biography from 2009, the last scientifically valid biography of Federico da Montefeltro. In a little while, then, I will also give you some quick information about the most recent news. To really cut our discussion to the bone, the sources that best describe the court in Federico's time are four. They are the Memoria Felicissima dello illustrissimo signor Duca Federico, Duca di Urbino e della sua famiglia che teneva. Most happy memory of the most illustrious Lord Duke Federico, Duke of Urbino, and his family by the courtier Susek. The anonymous text entitled Ordine et Offici de Casa dello illustrissimo signor Duca di Urbino, Order and Duties of the House of the most illustrious Lord Duke of Urbino. Third, the Istruzione breve e succinta, brief and succinct instruction, contained in Barberitiano Latino 5.159, rather similar to the text Ordine et Offici. And finally, the Commentario della vita del Signore Federico, Duca d'Urbino, commentary of the life of Lord Federico, Duke of Urbino, contained within the lives of Vespasiano da Bisticci. These sources complement each other in a way that is very useful for us. I shall not speak today of the Istruzione breve e succinta because it is unpublished and I am in the process of editing it. For the proceedings, I shall be ready to provide some information, referring for the moment to an article by Pier Giorgio Peruzzi published in 1986. Let us see instead the other three sources. First, most happy memoir. The first work, the Memoria Felicissima, was compiled by a courtier, perhaps of the Jewish religion, Susek, whose full name, by which he is quoted, is Susek de Casteldurante, antico corteggiano, qual prima fu paggio e poi camoriero del signor Octaviano. Susek from Casteldurante, old courtier, who first was page and then waiter of Lord Ottaviano. This text was composed after Guidobaldo's death, 1508. Susek first lists some of the many men virtuous in every science and faculty that Guidobaldo held in his court, including Baldassarre Castiglione and Pietro Bembo. Then he makes memory of the court of the most illustrious Lord Duke Federico of Urbino of most happy memory, which begins with the Duke himself, Ottaviano Ubaldini, and Guidobaldo, and has a hierarchical structure. First, 16 grand lords, exponents of the leading houses of papal Italy, such as Colonna, Farnese, Orsini, and Davarano. Then 24 counts. They are followed by 5 knights with golden spurs and 17 gentlemen. This is the part that we could call the military household of the Duke. We shall return to this aspect, which I think is fundamental. Then comes the section of those in charge of the education and lectures. 5 masters of the Lord Duke, who are Martino Filetico, Lorenzo Racanelli, who was a theologian who became Bishop of Urbino, 2 astrologers and a friar. 2 astrologers and a friar together. It's quite nice. The 7 secretaries he kept in cities outside the state, that is in Naples, Rome, Milan, and Siena. 5 secretaries at home, among them his biographer Pier Antonio Paltroni, and 13 chancellors. Then come the servants, 3 stewards, they are the scalchi, 5 personal waiters of the Duke, 3 meat-cutting servants, they are the trincianti, 17 squires who served at the table, 5 at the Duke's table, among whom are repeated the names of some of the chancellors, such as Ludovico di Mercatello. 22 pages that is, very young servants, among whom is one with the curious name El Biscione da Milano, the big snake from Milan, referring to the Sforza Visconti coat of arms, the Biscione. And our Susek, who is called here Susek of Benedetto from Durante. Susek from Benedetto is Susek from Baruch, probably, or from Durante. There follows 5 architects and engineers, among whom we immediately recognize Luciano Schiavone, that is Luciano Laurana, Francesco da Siena, Francesco di Giorgio Martini, Paolo Scirri da Castel Durante, and Fra Carnevale, while a certain Pippo Fiorentino remains unknown. Moreover, there are 3 chapel singers, 6 children who sing in the chapel, 28 footmen, 3 stewards at the dinette, il tinello, the table where the members of the household ate, 2 upholsterers with 2 workers. They are those employed to the work on tapestries. A master book illuminator with Francesco da Ferrara, with 1 apprentice, a fencing master to teach the pages, 2 dancing masters, 2 sideboard attendants, 2 chaplains, 6 cooks, 3 saddle masters, 3 spenders, 6 trumpeters, the messengers, a drummer with a silver drum called bruciaposto, burn place, a leopard attendant, yes, the Duke had a leopard, and another attendant for the hounds and greyhounds, and also the revenue master, the housekeeper, Massaro, and the muleteers with 10 mules. After that, we learn that Lord Ottaviano Ubaldini, Antonio di Montefeltro, who was Federico's natural son, Pier Gentile da Varano, and other unnamed gentlemen also had their own family, that is, a small personal court. There was also the court apothecary, 3 infantry colonels, and 2 organ players. A second memoir follows, anonymous, but which came to us transcribed by the same hand as the first. This one, in fact, may be the work of the same author, Susek. It describes the household beginning with its female part. It begins with Madonna Battista and her daughters, and continues with several women, housekeepers, maidens, and craftswomen, massare, donzelle, maestre, among whom is recorded Madonna Pantasilea, sister of Bronzo Baglioni from Perugia, a woman of sensible and prudent gravity elected to the government of the countesses after the death of Madonna Battista, a number of companions and servants of the said family who were old and governing men, Guidobaldo wet nurse, whose name was Domenica, a man who held the keys to all the rooms of the court, the weapon warehouseman capable of arming 300 people at once, the cloakroom attendants, 2 armorers, 2 men deputed to accompany women to parties, those who took care of Guidobaldo when he was little. In short, he paraded before us all the characters remembered by Susek and the anonymous extender of the second memoir, who was perhaps also written by him. Order and duties. If Susek text gives us names, another text gives us function, assignments, duties. This text is titled Ordine Uffici de Casa dello Illustrissimo Signor Duca di Urbino, published in 1932 and then in 1999. The text dates from a few years after Federico's death, probably at the time of Guidobaldo minority. It is a handbook, a ready-to-use manual that is a court regulation drawn up by a member of the household, by a courtian, codifying the practices and customs in use in the ducal palace. The offices named by Susan are all there, and their duties are explained in detail, in roughly the same hierarchical order as we already seen, with an even wider and more varied casuistry. It does not include the description of the first part, that is, that of the principal gentlemen who belong to the military household, and it does not include the family of women, the ones surrounding the countess. It lacks, therefore, the part of the court that we will call the noble part, Instead, it starts with a butler, maestro di casa, who is superintendent of the whole palace. Then there are the lord's steward, the cupbearers, those who serve at the table, etc. In addition to the position already mentioned, there are also many other. For example, the doctor, the barber, the master of pages, the fire attendant, the dress attendant, the librarian, and all those who have to take care of foreign guests, etc. In essence, the court of Urbino was divided into three parts: noble family, officers, and servants. To these were added the passing strangers. They too are treated well. The way this happens is accurately described. The maestro di casa must secretly let the Lord know about every important person passing through, and the Lord decide what treatment to give them at court. The courtiers must accompany guests to visit things worth seeing, like we will do in 2 days. And there are occasions where practically two courts meet together, as when in 1471, Borso d'Este came to Urbino with 500 horses and 150 mules and made a very great triumph, while the Count of Urbino did him great honor. Third, Vespasiano. Earlier we saw a long list of names contained in the nostalgic memory of an ancient page. The description of functions in a completely different text, a handbook. We now set them in motion through Vespasiano da Bisticci's account of Federico's life. Vespasiano, let it be said in passing, is well known. Hailing from the Florentine countryside, he was a cartolaio, a stationer, a manufacturer and dealer of books, and is most responsible for the construction of the Duke's Library, for which he worked for 14 years. He himself says that he lived at court. His life of Federico, written soon after his death and dedicated to Guidobaldo, is included, as you know, in a very large text belonging to the traditional genre of the lives of illustrious men. Federico is the second layman to be biographed after the King of Naples and a long series of churchmen. Here, the court is not properly called such, but there is extensive mention of patronage towards the architects, artists, men of letters, and copyists who were benefited by the Duke, as is written, for example, in a passage that says, he was, in short, the refreshment of all worthy men. Here we, therefore, find patronage mentioned. Here, at last, we also find mentioned indirectly Giusto di Gand. Federico was an expert in painting, and since he could not find masters who suited him in Italy, who knew how to paint in oil panel, he sent all the way to Flanders to find a solemn master, and had him come to Urbino, where he had him paint many paintings in a solemn manner, and especially in a studio of his own, where he had the philosophers, the poets, and all the doctors of the church painted. As I learned from Francesca Bottacin's study, critics almost unanimously identify the solemn painter mentioned by Vespasiano da Bisticci, Federico's bookseller, with that Giusto da Gand documented in the Corpus Domini papers. Some observations. Let us now try to offer some commentary observations. The first, Federico's court was quite gigantic, perhaps 600 to 800 mouths. That means 10% of the total population of the city, probably, rivaling those of other far more important dominions. But we are not familiar with this court in its entirety. We know Federico's household, and this is no small thing. As has been written, the household was the core of the court. Within the household, there are, as we have seen, three levels: the noble family, that is the couple of lords, their close relatives, the nobles, many of whom are men-at-arms, then the officers, and finally the servants. Some functions of the servants are reserved to persons of rank, but this is common in courts. Among the pages, then, there are also children of other gentlemen who receive their education outside the home. Among the officials, there are several characters whom we approach from the world of art and literature, but it is how we see them. They are the military engineers, masters, chancellors, secretaries. They are salarymen who serve the smooth running of the administrative machine, not only of the palace, but of the state. The only ones we would call true artists are the musicians. In the order and duties, they are called cantors, players, and pipers, pifferi. And the illuminator, which is apprentice, but he belongs to the lower part of the house. He is remembered after the upholsterers and before the fencing master. What we properly call the artists do not seem to have been a permanent part of the household. They were not proper members of the house, just as ambassadors, transitional figures, and some men of letters were not. They seem more like satellites, more mobile than the others, with a less defined position than other courtiers. Probably several artists and men of letters would have liked to enter the household, among other things, receiving in this way a fixed salary. A second aspect I wish to emphasize is the co-presence of pomp and moderation. Federico's court was lavish and hospitable. Magnificent parties were held there. Theatrical performances were attended. Suffice it to recall the reception given to Prince Federico of Aragon, who was passing through Urbino in 1474, graced by a theatrical composition by Giovanni Santi, and the sumptuous wedding between Elisabetta, daughter of Federico, and Roberto, son of Sigismondo Pandolfo Malatesta, in 1475. This way of life does not collide, but complements. It should be read together with the second way of life. The Duke was measured, temperate. According to Vespasiano da Bisticci, he did not even drink wine, and his house was regulated like a convent of religious. Jesters do not seem to be attested in his court. Federico, a refined person, was primarily a military man. The highest ranking individuals in his court correspond to members of the military household. As I was able to observe recently, 15 among the figures listed by Susek are the squad leaders who also appear in the list of the conduct of the Duke of Urbino. That is, in the list of commanders of his last army, the one that fought in the War of Ferrara, where Federico died of malarial fevers in 1482. They are joined by other figures such as Count Carlo Oliva of Pian di Meleto, Infantry Colonel Francesco Drago of Mercatello, and the Golden Spur Knight Francesco Cagnaccio of Sassatello, who are also named among household members and whom we know for a fact were commanders. In this context of pomp and order, the women of the family, although they attend parties and are received with honor, live withdrawn in reserved apartments where no one except the Duke, his son Antonio, and Ottaviano Ubaldini can enter. They are served essentially by other women and older men. Little Guidubaldo lives with them. Finally, the third concept I wish to dwell on is perhaps obvious, but I feel the need to make it explicit. The court lives in a very close relationship with the house, the domus. The form Vespasiano uses it to refer to the palaces of Montecerignone, Urbino, Casteldurante, Cagli, and Gubbio is precisely that of house, casa. And house, domus, is the term we return to in the grand epigraph carved in the courtyard of honor at the Ducal Palace in Urbino. The government of the state is thought of in the form of a house composed of the building and of the group of people who inhabit it. Servants assume public functions, become familiars and officials to whom the functions of the government are transferred within an increasingly centralized body. This is the concept masterfully summarized in Baldassare Castiglione's famous expression, a palace in the form of a city, which means not just a large palace, but a palace in which all the functions of the city are concentrated. This concept is also found in a beautiful phrase coined by Fabio Cusin, quoted by Carlo, and in turn taken up by Pier Giorgio Peruzzi in one of the most important studies on court life in Federico's time. Federico's political work, although this may seem a paradox, is the Ducal Palace of Urbino. Some words about the studies. After Federico and after Guidobaldo, after the courtiers, during the 16th century and until the devolution of the state of Urbino in 1631, there are other known texts that tell the story of Duke Federico. Then Federico and his city fall into oblivion. Urbino becomes a small peripheral town in the belly of the Papal States. Emptied of its treasures, the Ducal Palace is given the name of the Apostolic Palace. The Swiss Guards stay there. On the door jambs, we find much of their graffiti. We can summarize this long critical passage by recalling that in the 18th century inventories of the Grand Ducal Galleries, it was no longer known who the characters represented in Piero della Francesca's diptych were. Federico and Battista are then called Petrarch and Laura. After the long phase of oblivion, there is an age of recovery of the history of Federico and his duchy, about which I will write more when the proceedings are published. For the moment, I need only mention the names of Denniston, Ugolini, and Burkhardt, who in the mid-19th century literally rediscovered Urbino. Burkhardt, then, is the originator of the idea of the Renaissance as we still understand it today, and it is precisely Federico, described in a way that traces Vespasian's text, who from then on assumes the role of the perfect Renaissance prince. In the proceedings, I will also talk about the many authors who have written since then, while now I wish to focus only on the last phase of enormous revival studies, especially in court studies. A first phase is the season between the 80s and the 90s of the last century, in which a research project was active that was entitled Europe of Courts, Europa delle Corti. There was a great conference, Federico da Montefeltro, Lo Stato, le Arti e la Cultura, which was held in 1982 on the occasion of the 15th anniversary of Federico's death, and was published in 1986 in 3 volumes, essential, still now essential. After the flare-up of the 90s, the studies on Urbino continued for decades in short order. There's a lot of research, and some is significant. There are many, I will cite them. However, if I'm not mistaken, there are no real ambitious and communal projects. Instead, 2022 and the years immediately around it mark a period of great effervescence and renewed interest in Federico, and of course, also in the history of his court. The first inkling is 2021, with the release of Francesca Bottacin's book on Giusto di Gand and the Communion of Apostles. In 2022, the 600th anniversary of the birth of Federico da Montefeltro, a national committee for the celebrations is established. Important exhibitions are set up in Gubbio and Urbino. Numerous books, critical editions of texts and documents came out. I have written a review of all of these initiatives in an article to be published soon. That is the outcome of a conference held in Gubbio. You can get a rough idea of the volume of activities by consulting the website federico600.com. Federico600.com. With regard specifically to the history of the Urbino court, it is worth mentioning at least a few works that have among their greatest merits those of using new documentation. I am referring to Elisa Tosi Brandi's studies on the Rimini court and its intertwining with the Urbino court. Elisa Tosi Brandi makes use above all of material sources as jewelry and clothing and tapestries as well. That is very important, and the connection between North, Rimini, yes, sir, almost. And the inventories left that testify the presence of this object. Inventories that for Rimini are many more than for Urbino, whose archives, as we know, suffered a serious depletion in the 19th century. And I also include the study of Machtelt, Brüggen, Israels, that came out in the Burlington magazine, because she too makes use of important inventories that are not yet known. And I am also referring to the renewed studies on Ottaviano degli Ubaldini, perhaps the one most responsible for Federico's cultural program, and certainly the first in order of importance among the men of court, on whom Francesca Bottacin and I have organized a conference in December 2023. How we would love to know more about the small personal court remembered by Susek. I will close by mentioning the great possibilities that are currently emerging for the easier study of original sources. I refer to the digitalization project of the Vatican Apostolic Library. All the Urbinati Latini can be viewed from home very conveniently. In a few months, you will also be able to consult on an article by Claudia Montuschi, who is the director of the Manoscritti in the Vatican Library, about this. I am also referring to the Sanzio Digital Heritage Project of the University of Urbino, which envisages the digitalization of our archival and book heritage. And finally, I am referring to a project that, as part of an agreement between the State Archives of Florence and the State Archives of Pesaro and Urbino, has set as its objectives the partial digitalization of the first three classes of the Urbino fonts preserved in Florence, for a total of about 160 files, and the putting online of the images on the ministerial platform Archivio Digitale. So the archive of Urbino will be visible from everywhere. The first tranche of this project should be available next August. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Tommaso, and we are really in the court of Federico now. So, he studied fine art at the Kunstacademy in Düsseldorf and art history at the Free University of Berlin. He was assistant curator at the Stadtmuseum Frankfurt and then curator of Old Masters at Kunstmuseum Basel. And since 2008, he is the curator of early Netherlandish, German, and French paintings at the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin. And he curated and co-curated several exhibitions. I'm quite jealous because were all amazing exhibitions on the most amazing painters, I must say, like the Master of Le Mal and Rogier van der Weyden, The Road to Van Eyck, The History of the Kent Altarpiece, Jean Fouquet, and of course, Hugo van der Goes, that I have the chance to visit with him. Thank you again in Berlin last year. And last year he was awarded, because I studied, with the prestigious prize entitled to Max J. Friedlander, of course, by the Kupferstick Cabinet. So, ladies and gentlemen, speaking on the Mark triptych in Gand and Hugo van der Goes, Stefan Kemperdick.
Yeah, dear colleagues and friends, thank you very much. At first, I'd like to thank you, Francesca and Bart, for organizing this conference and, of course, for inviting me to speak here. This is fantastic, and for me, it will indeed be the first time to be in Urbino. Therefore, I'm not going to talk about Urbino. Instead, I will try to cover the first portion, the first part of the history, namely the Flemish history of this, well, group of painters, group of works. I already see a certain problem arising, and that is the quality of the color reproduction here is rather poor. And I'm going to talk about color, because what I'm going to do later on is to compare the colorism of this triptych and of Hugo van der Goes. And I mean, I have to refer to your memory, and I hope that you have all seen this work, which is in Ghent in the crypta of St. Bavos Church, in the original, as well as a number of works by Hugo van der Goes, because it does not look like that at all, not in the least. Well, all right. So this is the only work from the group that is discussed in this on this conference, during this conference that is in the Netherlands, still in the Netherlands, and that was even made for the Netherlands, namely for Ghent, because this is a triptych made for or in memory of Laurens de Maar. We will hear more on that, more on the historical facts later. But let me briefly summarize why this painting has been brought into connection with Hugo van der Goes. Well, you've already heard by Paula Nuttall, for example, that Giusto di Gand might well be a Joos from Ghent. And as it happens, we have a Joos van Wassenhove documented in Ghent, and we also, you've already heard that, we also have the document that this Joos van Wassenhove went to Rome at the time prior to 1475, so around 1470 or so. So before Joos van Wassenhove was in Ghent, and indeed he became a free master in Ghent in 1474. And 3 years later, when Hugo van der Goes himself became a master of the guild, Joos van Wassenhove vouched for him. That was ordinary practice, and it was not only Joos van Wassenhove, but also a wine and pigment merchant who vouched for Hugo. But there was clearly a connection between the two, the more so as Hugo might have lent some money to Joos. At least he got some money back from a rent that was due to him, also to Hugo, in compensation for money he had obviously given to Joos van Wassenhove. And Joos van Wassenhove did not start his career, as far as we know, in Ghent, but in Antwerp, where he already became a master in 1470. And that is exactly 7 years prior to the mastership that Hugo van der Goes acquired in Ghent in May 1467. Well, therefore, it is likely that Joos van Wassenhove was older, was a senior to Hugo van der Goes, and it has often been suggested, as you probably all know, that Hugo might have been the pupil of Joos van Wassenhove. There are even some authors, I think Paul Philippot in the first place. I think, Bart, we will hear more on that by you, who even suggested that this here is a useful work by Hugo van der Goes, highly unlikely, I would say. But it has been suggested he might have been the teacher of Hugo, but that is far from certain. Just the fact that he worked in Ghent and was older than Hugo doesn't mean that he was the teacher. And it does in no way mean that Hugo ever stays in the workshop of Joos van Wassenhove. What is more, we do not know if this triptych really was made by Joos van Wassenhove. There are certain similarities, a lot of them, to the communication of the apostles in Urbino. However, if it is one and the same hand is open to debate, and I'm not so sure of that. Anyway, this is, of course, a work that has often been brought into relation with Hugo van der Goes, compared with him. And in Ghent, where Hugo started his career, it is more or less the only work preserved from the time between around 1450 to 1480. There is literally nothing left. Max, you might know some very examples, but there is none. Huh? Later on in the 80s and 90s, you have a little bit left from Ghent, besides the works of Hugo, but not in these early days. So this is the only work in Ghent that can be compared with works by Hugo van der Goes, who started in Ghent. And now you all know the most famous works by Hugo, the Portinari altarpiece, really terrible, the illustration. This is the center panel, and the Monforte altarpiece in Berlin. This was probably made in the second half of the 1470s up to around 1480, and this in the first half of the 70s. And now if we compare these two works, and I took these two and not some of the smaller panels that are preserved from Hugo, because these are multi-figured historical compositions, as is the triptych there. And here the ratio of the size is approximately correct. So the Portinari triptych is much larger than the triptych in St. Bavos. Well, if we compare them in terms of composition and ratio between painted surface and figures, one must say there is a huge difference. I mean, here you have these monumental figures, and they are mostly erect, and they are extremely hard to see now, but they are really very heavy. You can feel their mass. They are standing on the ground, and they are arranged in a kind of strata, so to say, you know, whereas here the figures appear in comparison rather frail. They seem much more agitated, and you have a, if you want, more artificial composition where these throngs of people develop from behind, etc. So it is much more refined in a way, where this is much more down to earth, which is, of course, a new quality in Flemish painting of the time. So in terms of composition, I would say there is a very huge difference that is, in my eyes, even unbridgeable. It's the biggest difference you can imagine around that time. But what you do normally, if you compare two works of art or two artists, you look at figure types and at colors, which will be complicated here, as I said. But of course, I tried it with this very traditional art historical approach. Compare, for example, faces. And what you see here, central panel from the Ghent triptych, from the crucifixion, and here the Virgin Mary from the Monforte altarpiece. The faces are white in both cases. Otherwise, there is very little they have in common. What you have here, especially in the original, is this very plastic, bulky head where you can feel the skull beneath the skin, and you have a very strong feeling of the volume and weight. And this is rather absent here, I would say. I mean, in comparison, these faces are very nice and fine and very sensitively drawn, but they lack the mass of this one. And I would say also even the facial types have a certain similarity, but almost all early Netherlandish paintings from the 15th century share a certain vocabulary and have very similar faces. And if we continue, for example, this young mother from the right wing of the triptych in Ghent, we have such a face, very unlike the Virgin, but much more comparable in my eyes to the face of the Lucca Virgin by Jan van Eyck, although this was certainly painted 30 or maybe even 40 years earlier. And I mean, I hope that you can see it, it is really indeed very close. Even the shape of the ear is very similar. And if you place one of these heads above the other, which you can do in Photoshop, I do not have it here, they almost match exactly, except that this ear is further off. So there is a similarity to Van Eyck, but not so much to Hugo van der Goes, I would say, and the same applies to figures like this oval face. Sure, there is a certain plasticity here, but at the same time, it is much softer, much less plastic than in Hugo van der Goes, and in that respect, again, in my eyes, comparable to the Cybele, the Cumaean Cybele of the Ghent altarpiece. We can also compare heads of the angels. Angels are, of course, always very similar to holy women, and you have similar poses, for example, similar foreshortenings, but again, you see a completely different kind of head here, always marked by the very strong skull that you see here. Two figures lifting their eyes a little bit, and both have this slightly pouty expression. But then, as you can see, they are not really similar. I mean, this is not the same type, and it's a very, very different modeling. And that figure, again, compares, in my eyes, much better with the Eyckian Cybele. And if you look at the figures here, for example, this Magdalene from the crucifixion in Ghent with her hands raised. Of course, it's a motif similar to these two angels from the central panel of the Portinari triptych, but then you have these very strong and rigid and sound bodies of angels here, where this is, of course, in comparison, a rather artificial puppet now with a wasp waist and this huge bulk of drapery underneath. This is really a very different kind of conceiving a figure. And what you can see here very clearly, they are always resting their knees or their feet or whatever on the ground. So they are firmly anchored on the ground, which is hardly the case on this side. And here, you know, again, the faces, whatever you take, it is not very similar. And I mean, this can, of course, be compared in terms of the pure motif, these two, but in my eyes, they are really not very similar. And what you have here in Hugo, and this is a typical feature of him, you always have this big pronounced eyes, which in my eyes have certainly been taken from the model of Rogier van der Weyden. And here, this is hardly the case. Now, if we turn from the women to the men, I think we have a very similar result here in the Monforte altarpiece by Hugo. There are these two figures that might be, or probably are portraits, the man with the blue cap and the one with the black cap. And similar individualized faces you can also find in the crucifixion in Ghent. For example, here the knight in white satin. Here he can be in a way compared to that figure, or here this man with a lance in the foreshortening with that one. But it is only very, very general. I mean, you would not really bring them together. And then in both works, we have depictions of people of color. Here, the black magus from the Monforte altarpiece, and here, two black figures in the Calvary triptych in Ghent. And what you see is that the scheme, the type employed is completely different again. In these, you can also look at the beards. Here, a prophet from a painting in Berlin, the Nativity by Hugo van der Goes. Here, St. Joseph from the Monforte altarpiece, and here a bearded man. Well, not very similar. What they have in common, indeed, is this way to render the beard with these highlights. I mean, a middle grayish tone underlying, and then these very thin highlights applied on top. There are many people who do that. Dürer, for example. I do not know if it's so very specific. Otherwise, I would say, oops. Again, different facial types and different articulation of the faces. And again, I would say a work like the Ghent altarpiece comes closer if we look at such a figure here, this slightly morose looking man here from one of the panels in St. Bavo. It's a little bit of a caricature, of course, and it reminds one a little bit of this prophet on the lower central panel of the Ghent altarpiece. Well, so with respect to figures, not much similarity. However, there is one important and rare thing that works by Hugo van der Goes, or rather one work by Hugo van der Goes and the triptych in St. Bavo have in common. And that is a certain kind of aerial, or rather color perspective. So what you see here, and this is wonderfully done, is a kind of aerial perspective. Of course, the landscape fades into blue, but what you have at the same time is that the colors of garments of the figures also start to fade towards the depths of the painting. So even if you look, and I hope that you can see it in this projection, even the red here, although it is not extremely intense, is much more clearly more saturated than this one. And from here it goes to this pinkish color, and then here it is really bleached out, and here the colors merge into the landscape. And if we look at the right wing of Hugo van der Goes's Portinari altarpiece, as I said, certainly a late production of the painter, especially this wing, you have a similar color perspective, which is absent still in the Monforte altarpiece by Hugo van der Goes. What you can see here, for example, the red here of St. Margaret's dress becomes much more fainted here. And well, it's really hard to see, but I hope that you can recognize it. The colors likewise start to merge into the landscape and become dull. And then there is another very interesting feature. In this triptych, the painter realized, it was one of the very first times, I think, that you achieve much more depth, let's say, that you can create the feeling of a vast extent of the landscape by having figures coming up behind the edge of a path. So here's the sloping path, and these figures climb up the path so that you can only see the heads and the upper portions of the body. And you really have the feeling, okay, the place where Golgotha is elevated, and they really have to climb up that hill. And this is not so very often to be found. But you see it here in Hugo van der Goes. And of course, with Hugo's very particular, if not peculiar kind of humor, he only shows the heads, and they really look as if there were a row, as if there is a row of separate heads aligned along the edge of the path. But in fact, of course, these are the heads of the people from the entourage of the Magi coming up that path. But it's really remarkable. And that kind of color perspective can also be found in the work of an artist who might have been trained with Hugo, or might have worked in Hugo van der Roesen's workshop, and that is Art van den Bosche. And this is a painting documented for him and completed in the year 1490 from a triptych of St. Crispinian and Crispinianus. And what you see here, again, is the very same kind of very pronounced color perspective. So the fading, the very clear fading of colors towards the middle ground and then the background. And so now we are approaching the issue of color, which will be problematic with the projection, however. I mean, this work is marked, and I always found that, I mean, even when I saw it for the first time a long time ago, in the 1980s, in a way, it was not restored then. But now seeing it after the restoration, you are even more struck by its color scheme. The bright colors often tending towards pastel colors, and it has something of watercolor. And in English, there's always the word color. At least I do not know a better one, but it is colorful in the sense of the German word bunt, whatever that is in English, except colorful. It is in a way bunt. And this is something that is remarkable. And I mean, it's very different, both from Hugo van der Roes or Dirk Bouts or Hans Memling or other painters of the time. And if we make the direct comparison, here we have a panel, St. Luke drawing the Virgin by Hugo. That might be, I think, today a very early work by Hugo van der Roes. And you have this very bold combination of this reddish pink and a yellowish red and a reddish blue. And you sometimes have these colors here, red and pink and blue. But the overall impression is again very, very different, because these colors here are heavy. They are much more saturated than here. And the whole color scheme is embedded in a kind of chiaroscuro feeling. And yeah, as you can see, are very dark tones. So dark tones that enhance the feeling that the figures have volume and weight. And in other paintings like this one, for example, the Monforte altarpiece, you hardly have any similarity with the work in St. Bavo, and the same applies, of course, to such a small work as Hugo's the Vienna diptych, with its very straightforward color scheme, which is close to what we have seen in earlier times in works by Rogier van der Weyden. And here again, it is obviously very, very different. However, I come back to a comparison I made before. In terms of color, I think, again, the triptych in St. Bavo can best be compared with the Gand altarpiece, other way around. This is the Gand altarpiece, and this is a triptych. And not only because there is this man with a black beard and a blue cloak and a bright red hat in front, that might be just by chance, but nevertheless, this mixture of bright colors, different reds, etc., fits very well with each other, and there is no, I mean, they go very well together, I would even say. This is almost like a continuation here. And what we also have in the Gand altarpiece is this combination of different use of blue and red, not so good to see here, juxtaposed. And this is, of course, what we see here in the triptych, a greenish and a bluish blue, a greenish and a reddish blue. And here very strange in this figure, his purplish pose and this bright red dress, and then here another very strange changeant purple of the woman, and again I find much more similarities with works like that than with Hugo van der Goes. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
So, thank you. From the court of Federico to the Flanders. And now he is the head of the Center for the Study of the Flemish Primitives at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage in Brussels. He studied in Leuven University, and his PhD became a beautiful book on Rogier van der Weyden and stone sculpture in Brussels. He worked at the Prado Museum, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Belgium, and the Leuven University. He publishes and lectures on early Netherlandish art and the artistic relation with Spain, and now with Italy. And he was the director of the Verona project, an early research in open access that received the 2019 European Heritage Award. And I must say it's one of the most beautiful, successful, and COVID project. Now everyone is going closer to some painters, like close to Vermeer and so on. He has been so nice and patient, and I learned so much from him, and I'm so grateful. Speaking on the Ghent Calvary triptychs and its attribution Odyssey, ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Bart Fransen.
Thank you very much for this introduction. In this lecture, I want to discuss the painting that essentially initiated everything leading up to this symposium. The Calvary triptych, also called the De Maag triptych, preserved in the St. Bavos Cathedral in Ghent. It's a masterpiece of the Flemish region, and the occasion for the extensive research was the conservation treatment by the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage back in 2020. And as Paul Philippot has always emphasized, every restoration is a privileged moment for research. And that is precisely what we have done here, examining the triptych from various disciplines. In this lecture, I want to take you first and foremost through the fascinating history of the various attributions of this painting. There are few paintings of Flemish primitives where attribution has been so much questioned than this one. And secondly, I want to attempt to provide some new clues that do not focus on the attribution, but rather on dating. And also I want to involve in that section the predella, preserved also in Ghent in the Museum of Fine Arts. Now, anyone who reads the literature on the Ghent triptych will be amazed by the amount and variety of interpretations and attributions. Only one point do all authors seem to agree, namely the high pictorial quality and the art historical importance of this triptych, which has always been somewhat overshadowed by the world-famous Ghent altarpiece by the Van Eyck brothers, conserved in the same church. In an impressive landscape that extends over the three panels, we see on the central panel a Calvary with Christ nailed high on the cross and flanked by the good and the bad thief. To the right of the cross, as seen by the viewer, we can see only men. Two of them seem to have a prominent role. One on the foreground sits on a white horse and is richly dressed. The rider next to him points out the dead body of Christ on the cross. In the background, there is another man dressed in a rich cloak over there. He is not on a horse, but on a donkey and has his hands in his sleeves. He too is being explained something by a bearded rider in blue. On the left side of the cross, as seen by the viewer, we see mainly women, except for John the Evangelist and some extras in the background that came from the hill that Stefan Kemperich just described. In the foreground, we can see the Virgin Mary who has fainted, and all women express their grief and passion in various ways. On the side panels, we can see two stories from the Old Testament that are rarely depicted in Flemish panel painting. On the left, we see Moses making the water of Mara drinkable by holding a miraculous wooden stick in it. And on the right, we see Moses pointing the Israelites to the brazen serpent he had placed on a stick. The Israelites who looked at it were healed from snake bites and freed from poisonous creatures, which are depicted here as lizards. Now, the history. Unfortunately, there is not a single document from the 15th, 16th, or 17th century mentioning the triptych. The first mention dates only from 1777 in an inventory of the church where the triptych is associated with Hans Memling. A more detailed description of the triptych comes from a later 18th century inventory by Egidius van de Vivere de Wambeke. There we learn that the triptych was set up at that time in the St. Lawrence Chapel, that the shutters were placed separate above the central panel, and that there was a predella at the bottom depicting the siege of Jerusalem, which, according to the author, is definitely by another hand. In this slide, I have presented the predella somewhat larger in proportion in order to have a better legibility. In the first printed inventory of the church, from 1819, the author attributes the work to the workshop of Hubert van Eyck and reports that the predella is missing. We know now that the church sold the predella, that it circulated on the art market and in private collections for a while, and that it was purchased by the Ghent Museum of Fine Arts in 1958. In the years 1823-24, the triptych was extensively restored and received an attribution that would dominate the entire 19th century literature, namely to the Ghent painter Gerard van der Meren. During the restoration, it was decided to provide the newly added parts of the shutters with the inscription Pinxit Discipulus Hubert van Eyck, Gerard van der Meren, anno 1824, restauravit G. Laurent. The name Gerard van der Meren is not an invention of the restorer. Van der Meren was indeed a painter in Ghent. He is mentioned by Guicciardini, by Van Mander, and Antonius Sanderus as a follower of Jan van Eyck. However, driven by romantic chauvinism, this was seized upon by 19th century Ghent historians to add some big names to the Ghent painting school, which enjoyed less charisma than the Bruges one. This also involved some imagination, and in some cases even falsification of old documents. The attribution to Gerard van der Meren was therefore based on nothing. But it persisted throughout the entire 19th century. We see it confirmed, for example, by an engraving from 1862 on which the inscription Gerard van der Meren Pinxit figures at the bottom left, over there. The first doubts about the attribution arose only around the turn of the century. In the Biographie Nationale, Van Duys stated in 1897 that the attribution to Gerard van der Meren is a true legend. It is in 1907 that Hulin de Loo puts forward the name of Daniel de Rijke, an important painter very well documented in Ghent in the period 1440 to 1469, who painted works for, among others, the Italian family de Villa, the Bishop of Cambrai, and the Augustinians of Ghent, to name a few. Unfortunately, no single work of his is preserved today. According to Hulin de Loo, this Daniel de Rijke would have been the master of Giusto da Gand, the painter documented in Urbino in 1473-1475. Earlier, Hulin de Loo in 1900 had already identified Giusto da Gand with the painter Joos van Wassenhove, an identification for which, in our opinion, there are sufficient reasons to accept it. In 1916, Friedrich Winkler, then still a young man of 28, built on Hulin de Loo's hypothesis. He argues that the Calvary triptych is not by Giusto's master, but by Giusto himself, just before he left to Italy. He bases this on a number of stylistic characteristics common figure types, draperies, and facial features. Winkler's thesis quickly gains ground in art historical literature and soon makes the name of Daniel de Rijke quickly forgotten. Barely 10 years later, it was also decided to paint over the 19th century inscription with the name of Gerard van der Mere. During the same period, another discovery was made. In 1924, Victor Fries wrote a study about Laurens de Maar, the significant counselor of Philip the Good and receiver general for Flanders. He believes that Laurens de Maar must have been the commissioner of the triptych, along with his wife Louise van Hove, and he provides two arguments for this. Firstly, the oldest known place of preservation in the St. John's Church is the St. Lawrence Chapel, founded by his family in around 1462, and Dominique de Neff will after me delve deeper into this shortly. And secondly, the named saints of the couple are represented on the outside of the shutters, Laurens and Ludovicus. The lifespans of this couple would thus be an indication, thank you, for dating the triptych. Laurens dies in 1468, his wife Louise in 1483. I'm sorry, this is the wrong slide. This is the one. Because Laurens de Maar was considered the commissioner and Joos van Wassenhove the author, the dating of the triptych that followed was between 1462 and 1468. The attribution to Joos van Wassenhove and the identification of Laurens de Maar as commissioner have, without exaggeration, been the most crucial contributions in the literature on the triptych. An important event that contributed to the spread of these two propositions was the very first and so far only exhibition dedicated to the painter Eustace of Gand, held in Ghent in 1957-58, where the Calvary triptych was displayed alongside many other works attributed to the master. The oeuvre of Joos van Wassenhove was expanded, mainly based on stylistic comparisons, and remarkably, the Communion of Urbino was not used so much as a focal point, but also the Calvary of Ghent. Firstly, there is the Adoration of the Magi, painted on canvas, now preserved in the Metropolitan Museum, New York. It may originate from the Santa Clara convent in Burgos. The similarity lies in the rendering of space, the figure style, the posture of the characters, and some individual facial features. In our opinion, the resemblance of the Adoration to the Calvary triptych is much greater than to the Communion in Urbino. The further connection of these works will be further explored by Marion Ainsworth on Wednesday. In addition, there are a number of other works mentioned in the literature that testify to the artistic context in which the Ghent Calvary triptych can be situated. In 1957, in the exhibition in Ghent, this Calvary on panel was also exhibited and attributed to Justus van Ghent, Joos van Ghent. Today, we see it more as the work of a follower of Dirk Bouts. Then there is a triptych located in Naples in a very bad state of conservation, but interesting because it represents Saint Magdalene on the right wing in a posture directly borrowed from the Calvary triptych of Ghent. Didier Martens in 2009 attributes the work to the master of Monte Oliveto, whom he considers a Bruges master active in the period 1480 to 1500. He attributes the resemblance between both figures to a common model. However, we have noticed that both figures are represented on the same scale, so we cannot rule out that there is a direct connection, possibly a mechanical transfer of a model, but therefore we need more technical research on the painting in Naples. There is also an impressive crucifixion with donors recently acquired by the Prado Museum and situated in the circle around Hugo van der Goes. Only Henri Pauwels has associated the work with Eustace of Ghent. A comparison with the Ghent triptych is particularly relevant regarding the body of Christ, but also the landscape in the distance. And José Juan Pérez Preciado will delve into this on Wednesday. Lastly, a name that appears in the literature frequently when it comes to the sources of inspiration for the Ghent triptych, and that I have not yet mentioned, is that of Dirk Bouts. Indeed, the figure types, the postures, and also spatial rendering seems to be borrowed somehow from the Leuven city painter, particularly from the crucifixion preserved in Brussels. For Kathleen Perrier-Dieteren, the Calvary of Gand can even be considered one of the works that best illustrate the artistic personality of Justus of Gand through his imitation of Dirk Bouts. But in the course of the 20th century, there are also increasingly critical voices about the dogmatic attribution of the Gand triptych to Joos van Wassenhove / Giusto da Gand. Objections to the attributions come from experts such as Max Friedlander, Albert Châtelet, and Dirk de Vos. They point to significant stylistical differences between the works in Urbino and in Gand, as well as a significant difference in quality, with the work in Urbino being inferior compared to the carefully painted triptych in Gand. Some authors minimize these differences and point to differences in scale, adaptation to Italian taste, or to the poor conservation condition of the panel in Urbino. However, for other authors, the differences in conception and technique are so great that both works cannot possibly be made by the same painter. One of the early skeptics, Antoine de Schrijver, already in 1957, reverted to an older attribution, to Daniel de Rijke, albeit without new evidence, except perhaps for the inscription, except maybe for the inscription R.I.K. here in the border that he considers to be a signature of de Rijke. More recently, in 1992, Paul Eekhout also believes that the triptych in Gand cannot be attributed to Giusto da Gand. He suggests identifying Giusto of Urbino not with Joos van Wassenhove, but with a certain Giusto Gualtieri di Guante, a Fleming documented in Florence in the 1440s, and he then suggests that the Gand Calvary triptych is an early work of Hugo van der Goes. The proposals of de Schrijver and Eekhout have barely been followed, but they have been able to demonstrate the weaknesses in assuming that the triptych in Gand and the Communion in Urbino are by the same hand. The purpose of the research project at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage was to readdress these questions, but using research techniques that our predecessors did not have. High-resolution images in macrophotography, infrared reflectography, macro-XRF analysis, and dendrochronology. We will undoubtedly hear more about this tomorrow. In this slide, finally, I have included all the names associated with the triptych and or with Joos van Wassenhove in a timeline. And it is remarkable to note that the literature on this triptych is dominated by an obsession with the problem of attribution. It seems that the quest for a correct dating of the painting is subordinated to the search for the name of a painter. Hence, I suggest shifting our focus away from the matter of attributing the Calvary triptych and instead turning our attention towards dating it. The authors who adhere on one hand to an attribution to Joos van Wassenhove before his departure to Rome, so somewhere in the early 70s, and the authors who adhere to the proposition that the commission was placed by Laurens de Maar before his death in 1468, deduce from this that the triptych is situated in the late 1460s. If we were to set aside the assumptions launched by Friedrich Winkler and Victor Friss more than 100 years ago, where would we stand then? Where is the basis for dating? Stefan Kemperdik already pointed out that the color palette of the triptych and also the changeant effects in the clothing might suggest a later dating. Here are some other images. During the online meetings, Stefan Kemperdik also highlighted the fact that the grisailles on the outside of the triptych show pedestals that slightly protrude forward, which is not typical for the 1460s and could rather be placed in the 1490s of the 15th century. On the left, we see the outside of the, here we see the outside of the Hippolytus altarpiece from about 1475 with the grisailles of two patron saints on typical hexagonal pedestals in a niche as introduced by Jan van der Verneyck and van der Weyden. And on the right side, we see the outside of the Last Judgment triptych of Zierikzee made in Brussels around 1500s. On it, the two sculptures are presented in a shallow niche with the two pedestals protruding from the surface. They seem to enter the space of the viewer. This also seems to be the case with the representation of the two pedestals in our triptych in Gand. Due to the poor preservation of the paint layer in that area, we do not find any traces of coats of arms, but upon closer examination, we do get the impression that there is a kind of decoration of leaves under the pedestal, exactly comparable to this example made by a Brussels anonymous painter by the end of the 15th century. Now, to date our triptych, I would also like to take a closer look at the predella, which is preserved in the Ghent Museum of Fine Arts and which is an incredible masterpiece. Because the style and the execution of this predella are so different from the triptych, it is attributed to another master. The differences between the two pieces have even led many authors to suspect that the works never belonged together. Rarely have both pieces been studied as an ensemble, and that is precisely what we choose to include. That's why we have chosen to include this predella also in our research, and I'm very grateful to the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent for granting us access to examine this masterpiece with macrophotography, infrared reflectography, and also dendrochronology. If the predella and the triptych form an ensemble and were ever designed together, albeit executed by different artists, is it possible that they date from the same period? That is the question that we want to raise here. The predella depicts an event that is exceptional for 15th century panel painting, namely the siege of Jerusalem by the Roman army led by Emperor Titus. I can find no other painting from that period with this depiction. Since the publication of Van Elslande in 1990, the siege is often associated with the siege of Ghent in 1488 by the Habsburg Emperor Frederick III and his son Maximilian. This fact is then used to date the predella around 1490, namely after the siege of Ghent. But the arguments put forward by Van Elslande do not hold water. On the tents of the Roman soldier, the alliance coat of arms, Burgundy, Austria, would be visible. But if we zoom in on the macro photos, it is clear that there is no real alliance coat of arms. A mishmash coat of arms is represented, most of which have no meaning. The coat of arms on the left here could be that of Austria, but equally of the Duchy of Lower Lorraine or the county of Vianden, which were already part of the Burgundian Empire even before the union with the Habsburgs. And to identify the other coats of arms, we would have to be extremely forgiving of the painter's use of color to want to see anything of Burgundy of Austria in them. No, these coats of arms have no hidden meaning, as Van Elslande calls it. A second argument often used, also by the museum in Ghent, to associate this representation with the siege of Ghent in 1488 is the double-headed eagle. This indeed appears multiple times, both on the flag and on the helmet and the blazoned journade of the Emperor Titus. But the double-headed eagle is not a reason to representation, to link with the Habsburg army only. The double-headed eagle was very common in medieval iconography as a reference to the Roman Empire, as evidenced, for example, by the representation of the siege of Jerusalem in the Rhine Bible of Jacob van Magerland from 1332. The siege of Ghent of 1488 has little to do with the iconography of the predella, not even as a glimpse. So what are the clues then for dating the predella? Thomas Kren will talk tomorrow about the similarities with illuminated manuscripts, especially with that of the Vienna Master of Mary of Burgundy. I won't go into that today. In my research, I was intrigued by an article by Claude Gaillet about the armor depicted in the predella. Gaillet was one of the leading specialists in Belgium on military history and weapons in the southern Netherlands from the 13th to the 15th century. And in 1962, he published this article in the Italian journal Armi Antiche. He discusses the weapons used by the knights and the infantry. Some correspond to the weapons of the 15th century, but others are highly fanciful. For instance, he reflects to the two catapults set up in front of a city wall, and he calls them absurd. The bundle of ropes is replaced by a hinge point. Some elements are represented upside down. There is no tension mechanism. There is no holder for the projectile, which is this one, except for the wooden beam, whose practical utility is difficult to discern. Gaillet also discusses the shields and the various armors, paying extra attention to the different kinds of helmets. The barbute, the sallet, the great bascinet, the various types of bourgonet, with or without a visor, an apex, or ear protectors. And based on these helmets, and especially the presence of the bourgonet, who is depicted models who were used in Europe only from 1490-95 onwards, Gaillet believes that the predella cannot possibly have been made before this date. Now, stimulated by Gaillet's study, I dived into the world of medieval armor and armory, which I admit was until recently a relatively unfamiliar but fascinating territory for me, showing an evolution in time that continually adapts to new military needs, rather than to tastes, as is the case with fashion. So I went looking for comparisons between the predella and the Gand triptych, whose depicted armor has never been studied before, logically, because there are hardly any soldiers represented. But the few military elements depicted do help us with dating. Firstly, there is the horse's barding, with its head of a lion, flanked by leaf decoration. This is very similar to the one on the predella, and it has a Renaissance-like appearance. Given the scene of the siege of Jerusalem, it is logical for the emperor's horse to be military equipped. But for the cavalry triptych, it is exceptional for the horse to wear barding. The depicted rider is not a soldier. For the barding, the painter was not inspired by Dirk Bout's cavalry in the Brussels Museum, not even by Van Eyck's knights from the Ghent altarpiece. Could it be that the painter was inspired by the predella for this, or is it the other way around? Of course, it could be the artist's fantasy, but it is remarkable that the master of the triptych and that of the predella share the same fantasy. A second remarkable similarity in the military equipment can be seen in the fan plates or side wings of the rider's pull-in. This is the protection of the knee in armor. In order to reinforce the armor and make it resistant to impact, the side wings were often decorated with fluting, grooves or channels carved into the surface of the armor. Although this reinforcement in the Gand triptych is additionally gilded, we do recognize a similar circular motif in both decorations. And finally, there is the visored helmet, worn by the standing man to the right behind the main horseman. This type of helmet is called sallet, and it also appears in the predella, right next to the Emperor Titus, this man. There is a soldier with a sallet with a movable visor. The basic version of the sallet had no visor and consisted only of one piece of metal. We see it, for example, here depicted in Gerard Stavid's work from 1488. And many such models still have been preserved, as we can see in this example. But the example depicted in the Gand triptych is a sallet with a movable visor that covers the entire top half of the face, like we can see in this example conserved in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The visor pivots at the sides but has a side cut out horizontally to create an opening to see through. Along the sides of the skull, there are small holes filled up in order to keep the internal lining in place. In the Gand Calvary triptych, these holes are finished with decorative rivets, as we can see, similar to the ones that we can see in this example conserved in Philadelphia. This kind of salad appears in many artworks from the second half of the 15th century onwards, as can be seen, for example, in Gerard David Passion altarpiece from 1491, conserved in Lübeck, or by the famous print of the writer Albrecht Dürer from 1513. But there's one striking difference. In the comparative salads, the skull and the tail are made of one single piece of metal. In the Gand Calvary triptych, however, the salad has a tail that consists of an articulation of various limbs that allow the movement of the head. This distinctive feature is only known to us from examples from the 1480s onwards, as we can see in this example, preserved in the Leeds War Gallery, where the tail consists of two metal limbs. However, the number of limbs could vary, as we can see from another example preserved in the Worcester Art Museum, and a similar example is also preserved in Vienna, which once belonged to Maximilian of Austria and is therefore richly decorated. The salad of the man in the Gand triptych, common from 1480 onwards, and the few similarities between armors in the predella and those in the triptych will not provide the final decisive factor in dating the ensemble. For that, we need to combine the results from other disciplines. But these observations may open up the possibility of placing the execution of the triptych and the predella slightly closer than is generally assumed. And I don't think that we can date the predella earlier, but rather that we have to date the triptych later, namely from 1480 onwards. I am aware that this undermines the attribution to Joos van Wassenhove, and also that the works attributed to Joos van Wassenhove based on this triptych lose an important foundation and therefore need to be reconsidered. That happens to be one of the purposes of this symposium. I'd like to conclude my lecture with a quote from Max Friedlander, wherein he offers guidance to scholars on how to respond to what he calls, and I quote, the insatiable hunger for names on the part of the collectors and art dealers. You may do your best by talking to these people and pointing out to them that every work of art, even the poorest one, is due to a human being who has borne a name, and it depends on accidental circumstances whether the name is known or not. Thank you for your attention, and thanks to all these people.
Thank you, Bart. It was so interesting. So I go quick. We have our last speaker. She studied at the Catholic Universität in Leuven. Since 2003, she has been a research assistant at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage, conducting researches on the pre-Etienne panel painting. Then she worked at the Center for Study of the Flemish Primitives, contributing to publications, including the Ghent altarpiece. She's also involved in the Verona project, focusing on the Turin and Milan hours. And she conducted research on the Royal Institute during the time of Paul Coremans, its first director. And she's so kind and skilled, especially in archival researches. I have appreciated so much her speeches during our online congresses. So, ladies and gentlemen, speaking on the commission and the authorships of the Ghent Calvary altarpiece, Dominique Denef. Okay.
And for the next diapositive, how about to do that?
I really don't know because I didn't use it.
Okay.
Maybe
Good afternoon. So I will talk about the commission and authorship of the Ghent Calvary Triptych. In this presentation, I will talk in particular about the commission and authorship of the Ghent Calvary Triptych. In a first point about its commission, in a second on the foundation in the St. John Church in Ghent, mainly based on archival material from Ghent City and State Archives. In a third, on the location of the chapel, and in a fourth point, I will present some new insights concerning the authorship of the Ghent Calvary Triptych and launch a hypothesis for a new attribution for the painting of the triptych. As concerns the commission, I will further elaborate on the hypothesis developed in 1924 by Victor Fris, who indicated a certain Laurens de Maar, a wealthy member of an ancient bourgeois Ghent family, as the commissioner of the altarpiece. He was married to Louise van Wassenhove. The two saints in grisaille on the reverses of the wings of the Calvary triptych refer to their patrons, Saint Lawrence for Laurens and Saint Louis for Louise. He died the 6th of March 1468 and his wife on the 31st of December 1483, and the couple had 3 sons and 7 daughters. First here, briefly, some information on this man. He was born around 1407-1410 as the illegitimate son of Laurens de Maar, dean of the St. Varelis Church in Ghent, who died in 1416. Margaretha de Brune was his mother. His grandfather was also named Laurens de Maar, dean of the Weaver, married to Avezoete de Brune. The Laurens de Maar, who we are talking about here, lost both parents when he was young, and he became an orphan. He was raised by his aunt Christina de Brune, and later by a priest. During his younger years, he was noticed for his remarkable qualities by the ducal secretary of Philip the Good, and in 1446 he was nominated as general receiver of Flanders, Artesia, and Mechelen, a high function comparable with the head of general accounts. He was a very wealthy man due to heritage, able to borrow large sums of money to the Duke at several occasions. He then settled in Ghent, where he bought houses in the immediate vicinity of the St. John Church, opposite the southern side of it. In 1462, he transfers his position as general receiver to his son-in-law from Tournai origins, Christopher Buridan, the husband of his eldest daughter, Philippotte. After that year, Laurens de Maar was appointed as special advisor of Philip the Good, and after his death, of Charles the Bold. In our second point, we will focus on archival documents that reveal some information on Laurens de Maar's foundation in the St. John Church. Several archival sources can be related to that. The first deed dates from 8 years before his death, on the 31st of October. In it, we can read that in the box, Laurens de Maar en de jonkvrouwe Louise van den Hove hef geordonneerd en gefundeerd een zekere dienst van nu, eeuwige dagen, per consent van voorzijden kerkmeester, te weten alle dagen in messen, gezongen zal zijn bij 7 priester van de quotidianen. They have ordered for daily masses in the Church of St. John in Ghent to be performed by 7 priests and to held on an altar that they will choose soon. And then also een jaargetijde in het koor van de voorzijde kerken van Sint-Jan elk jaar, etc. A yearly season mass to be held every year on St. Lawrence Day in the core of the church. The last, as well as distributing alms to the poor, will only be executed after the death of one of them. So there is no information on the altarpiece in the act. A second source revealed that at the time the first stone of the western tower of the church was led, that was on the 25th of May 1462, Laurens de Maag founded his chapel. It was located, I read the Old Dutch passage, neffens de Kevie, Sint-Jans, aan de zuidzijde van de kerkenwestvaart van derzelfde Kevie. The word Kevie can mean small portal, staircase, entrance, extubing part of a building, transept with door, something like that. Some new findings provide more details about the foundation of Laurens de Maag. There is a second deed from 1463, of which a 16th century copy exists, not known by Fris, in which the conditions for the previous deed from 1460 were further specified. Moreover, they were given permission to close their chapel with a fence to which they had the key and to embellish it with stained glass window with portraits. A last deed related to the foundation dated from 1484 on the 3rd of April was registered after the death of the wife of Laurens on behalf of the heirs of the de Maags, that were at that moment the two still living sons, Jacob and Klaas de Maag, and the eldest daughter Philippote, at that time the widow of Christoffel Buridan. In honor of their parents and for the salvation of their souls, and for their deceased brother as well, a detailed overview is given of specific masses that have to be done there. The season masses, the sprinkling of the graves with holy water, etc., etc. It clearly mentions that Laurens de Maag was buried in his chapel, as you see in the yellow box. But where was the chapel situated in the St. John Church? A coat of arms codex from circa 1623 clearly mentioned that Laurens de Maag was buried in de eerste kapelle van den Beuk naast de Zuiddeuren, in the first chapel of the nave next to the southern door. To the right of this coat of arms is written Sepulture, Laurens de Maag, Raad, Mens, Geduchtes Heren, etc. in this epitaph. Laurens' wife, who died in 1483, on the other hand, was not buried in the just mentioned de Maag Chapel in the St. John Church, where her husband was, but in the choir of the monastery of St. Agnete, St. Agnes, as one can read from the text next to the coat of arms, Maagd, Hove, Sepulture van Louise van Hove, weduwe van Wijle Laurens de Maag, etc. Some sources confirm that immediately after the death of her husband in 1468, she withdrew from public life and entered the cloister, taking with her her 5 remaining daughters. An interesting codex, unknown by Fris, giving a lot of information on the life in the monastery where Louise retired, is this Chronieke des Kloosters van Sinte Agnete binnen Gent, written in 1578. This is how we further come to know that Laurens de Maag donated a huge sum of money from 1461 on until his death to build new sleeping quarters for the cloister and get the water supply fixed. And that his eldest daughter Isabelle held a high position there as a nun, as she was present in 1469 for the laying of the foundation stone of the new ale in presence of Margaretha van York. So on the question, the third point, where this chapel is located, we must outline briefly the building history of the St. John's Church. In 1460, it had the aspect of a Roman church with a large crypt and choir. The choir was further extended in an expressive way during the Second Gothic period, with many chapels and 5 large red chapels, still conserving the old Roman nave. The lowest picture shows the building before 1462, displaying a long Gothic choir and a small Roman nave. In 1462, the first stone was laid for a massive western lower tower at a certain distance from the church. The construction took several years as the tower was not completed until 1534. You can see on these models the situation at that time with the huge tower, the old nave, and the large Gothic choir. The arrow indicates the emplacement of the Maagd chapel. It is the first chapel in the nave aside the southern transept. But the chapel had to be rebuilt as the nave was broken down. The demolishing works of this nave started around 1533, and it was gradually replaced by a higher and larger one in harmony with the rest of the building. The entire works were finished circa 1559. This also meant that the furniture of the Maagd chapel had to be taken away. The altarpiece that probably embellishes the altar there had to be taken to a safer place during these years. As we know that the Maagd family had an impressive house in front of the southern side of the church, we can assume that during this long period, the altarpiece was removed to their houses. This could also be the case during later threats in 1566 or 1568, but all this cannot be confirmed. An interesting discovery is a deed from 1534 that confirms that the Maagd chapel will be rebuilt. We can further read that the permission was given to the descendants to use the Joosveidkapelle for proper ceremonies and masses they were used to do in their own chapel until their chapel was fully furnished and finished. De gebruikenen in besloten kapellen staan in dezelfde kerken die men eet Joosveidskapelle en de aldaar te doen dat zij in huren voor zij de kapellen gewone waren te doen, tot de tijd dat deze met allermeer aankleed volmaakt zal worden. This testified to a particular bond of friendship that must have existed between the two families through their relatives, the Veid descendants, of course, via Triest, and the couple Veid Borluut, as the couple Veid Borluut has no children, and the Maagd. The analysis of the documents have led to new insight regarding the commission of the altarpiece. The assignment for it was, in our opinion, based on archival sources, not placed by Laurens de Maagd himself, nor his wife, as assumed, but most likely after 1484 by the heirs mentioned in the Act of 1484, which may be the reason why Laurens de Maagd and his wife are not depicted as usual. It is as kneeling commissioners, as is the case, for example, of Joosveid and Elisabeth Borluut, who were still living when the altarpiece was painted. The surviving de Maagd heirs take a great responsibility in following up the wishes of their parents concerning their chapel. They could have ordered the altarpiece in 1484 or later in memory of their parents to decorate the parental chapel. When looking at the altarpiece here opened and closed, it seems that some portraits were depicted in it, not on the wings representing the Old Testament scene, but in the central panel with representation of the New Testament. In the center, Christ on the cross between two murderers, and in the front we have Mary fainting, physically supported by two holy women, while St. John watches the scene. The rider on the white horse, who cast his gaze at the crucifix, as the crucified Christ, show a characteristic face. We can consider, hypothesis of course, as Laurens de Maagd. He wears a velvet bonnet, decorated with pearls and gems. The man behind him looks very much like him. He could be considered as the father of Laurens, Dean of the St. Farid's Church. In our hypothesis, these portraits are, of course, posthumous. And it's possibly that since there could not have been any painted or sketch available of the latter, a close copy of Laurens de Maagd was the inspiration for this portrait. He was a very wealthy man from Laurens inherited. His clothing in a purple burnished cloth, fur trimmed at the sleeves, as well as a matching vest, can correspond with that of a high-placed cleric. As for comparison, we can see, for example, here in the portrait of Carondelet, here represented as the dean of the cathedral of the chapter of Besançon. The woman standing alone, holding her hands in the air in despair at some distance, being Mary Magdalene, could maybe refer to the widow of Laurens de Maagd. An argument for this is that she originally looked at her husband, as you can see in the underlying drawing, while in the painted version, she pays more attention to the holy event, looking in the direction of the swooming Mary. Also, Lawrence on his horse initially looked in her direction in the drawing, as you can see here on the infrared reflectogram, but looked upright towards the Savior in the painted version. Maybe the 5 female characters to the left of the woman in despair, led by the weeping woman drying her tears, could refer to the daughters who entered the cloister. So, what's the pointer? For the pointer?
I don't know.
Okay. It's
Somebody knows.
no.
Bart, you know, where is the pointer? I didn't use
Is it this? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, yeah, but so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sometimes a bit difficult with this. Further, there seems to be a portrait inserted between the riders on the right side of the central panel. It concerns the man wearing a white robe with a white cloth draped over his shoulders, holding a stick in his hand as a sign of dignitary. His shoulder-length hair cover his ears, and some feathers decorate his head. His horse's chest is embellished with a white boarding bordered with garland and decorative relief patterns, as Bart Fransen showed. And here, the rider on the left wears the emperor's crown, with on top of it also this famous double-headed eagle, also represented on his chest. So most likely, for me, referring to the Roman Empire. We have to discuss, of course, this topic. Remarkably, in the triptych, this figure was not foreseen as such in the underlying drawing, as you can see on these infrared reflectograms. Another face appears instead, showing a large nose, looking the other direction, and 2 figures stand at some distance aside. They were not painted, so there has been an important change of composition between both faces, drawing and painted executions. The painted figure could be identified as the young Maximilian of Austria, Archduke of Austria, before he became Emperor of the Holy Empire, as there are some similar characteristics from the excellent chronique of Antonius de Rovere, where Maximilian is presented a ring to Mary of Burgundy. Here he has the same haircut, and also the feather and hairband appear. He married her in 1477, she died in 1482. And note that the joyful entry of Maximilian in Ghent took place in 1485. The specific facial feature of the man on the Ghent painting, nose, mouth, eyes, haircut, do also remind in a portrait of the young Maximilian from 1494. In our fourth and last point, hypothesis for a new attribution of the Ghent Calvary triptych will be explained. We will first talk about the archival sources concerning Joos van Wassenhove. Joos van Wassenhove was registered as a free master at the St. Luke Guild in Antwerp in 1464. He became a master in the Ghent Painters Guild. In 1467, he vouches for Hugo van der Goes upon his entry into the Ghent Painters Guild. The year after, in 68, his first official order, according to the Ghent city accounts, is registered as he's paid, the 19th of January, for 40 shields with the coat of arms of the Holy Father, the Pope, to be placed in the St. John Church above the seats of the clergy and confessioners in the choir, at the occasion of this papal indulgence named Groot Pardoen. Joos worked at the same time as Hugo van der Goes, as he was paid in the same account, same date, for paintings, no further specified, also for the Groot Pardoen. This groot pardon, great indulgence, was issued by the Pope, the then Pope, installed in Ghent by his representatives, nuncius, for example, where the opportunity was given to Christians to confess in the St. John Church and thus obtain an exceptional indulgence. It was installed for 7 consecutive years and lasted a limited time of the year until the Feast of Epiphany. In January 1469, Jos and Hugo van der Goes both are mentioned in Gent city accounts as guarantors for Agnete van den Bosch and Sanders Bening's entry in the Painters Guild. The last mention of Jos van Wassenhove was in an account giving an overview of the house rent of Hugo van der Goes, wherein is mentioned that Jos van Wassenhove left for Rome. Jos van Wassenhove te Rome waard. This would have taken place in 1470. An indication that it could have taken place before, at the latest, April 13, 1478, is a payment register in which only Hugo van der Goes was paying in the context of the Groot Pardoen for 13 shields with the coat of arms of the Pope and 15 smaller ones to decorate the city gates and other places. Jos van Wassenhove is no longer mentioned there. The question remains, of course, if Jos went, when he left Ghent, really went to Rome, as the written source states, but for which there is no evidence until now. The Pope who gave the order to install this Groot Pardoen in Ghent, which was done, of course, by help representative from Rome in Ghent, was Pope Paul II, alias Pietro Barbo, Pope from 1464 until his death in 1471. Here you see his profile portrait, a bust, his thumb and coat of arms, and it's the last item in color. That is probably what Jos van Wassenhove and Hugo van der Goes have to paint repeatedly. Let's go back to the Ghent Calvary triptych now, and here's some observation. The painter can, in our opinion, cannot be the same as the art of the Urbino painting by Giusto di Gand, as the style too much differs, in particular in the proportion of the figures, the head versus the bodies, which is larger in the latter. In the execution of the hands, they are larger, they're heavier in the latter. And in the filling of the space where the figures are bigger in proportion to the available space next to other stylistic and technical differences. The painter of the Ghent Calvary, and that's the example that Bart gave, I've seen. But I want to stress the fact that this artist has been clearly inspired by other painting for a lot of elements of his composition. This has already been demonstrated in literature and said by colleagues in our previous meetings on the topic. The painter probably worked using sketches, as certain settings or figures known from other paintings are integrated in his work. In addition, and these are other examples related to bouts, the figure of Moses on the right shows a similar profile as the Apostle of the Last Supper in Leuven, of which his hand is turned outwards and thus difficult to depict, which also appears in the Ghent Calvary triptych in the hand of the soldier, upper left corner. And there is also the figure of St. John in white, which is also similar in both work. Here on the left, the detail of the left murderer hanging on the cross in an original way, as he also is on the triptych from the Flamel group kept in Liverpool. Or the crying woman drying her tears that we can see in Rogier van der Weyden's oeuvre. More striking even is a white horse on the left wing of the Ghent altarpiece that was nearly literally copied by the painter of the Ghent Calvary triptych. The horse head there also displays its open mouth, the protruding curling tongue, and raised upper lip, neck, and position of the legs are also identical in both paintings. A well-filled purse does not only hang on Jos Ver's belt as a sign of wealth and capital, but also Laurens de Maar clearly exposes that he has a lot of resources at his disposal. That the painter of the Ghent Calvary triptych was inspired by the Ghent altarpiece is in particular clear by the form he chose for the format of his triptych, displaying the same upper profile with round arches. In case of the Ghent altarpiece, the upper wing was composed of two individual parts that can be folded. In case of the Calvary, it only forms one piece. The painter must have had an admiration for the Ghent altarpiece as he took over the format and further details, or was it the wish of the commissioners to take something similar for the chapel? We will now try to explain our démarche that leads us to formulate a new attribution for the Ghent Calvary triptych. During the research we did in the Ghent city archives, our attention went to a certain painter named Augustin de Brune, active from 1466 until 1488 in Ghent. Here, the most important facts of his career. In 1466, he became free master in the Painters Guild. In 1680, he vouches for Hendrik Hossendrecht for his entry in the Painters Guild, did the third payment, while Hugo van der Goes was responsible for the second with another painter. In 1481, de Brune was paid for paintings for the Abbey Church of St. Peter in Ghent, no further details on that, and in 82 for the restoration of the painting in the meeting room of the Council of Flanders, Raad van Vlaanderen. He was an important painter from the direct surroundings of Joos van Wassenhove and Hugo van der Goes. Moreover, the name de Brune is closely linked to the Maags. Here I show you a very simplified family tree of Laurens de Maag, where de Brune appeared in the female line of his ancestor as his mother and grandmother bear the name, and also does his aunt, Augustine de Brune, the painter. On the other hand, we know that the name of his father was Peter, but further than that, we have no information. This Peter could be the brother of Christine and Margarethe de Brune, but that wasn't proven until now. The Maags couple were, so the de Brune, the painter, could be family or the son of a brother of the aunt of Laurens de Maag. So we continue with the archive on Augustin de Brune, who restored the painting of the Last Judgment in the meeting room of the Council of Flanders and was paid for it, as we read. Meester Augustin de Brune schilder wonende te Gent de somme van 30 pond Parisis, over stoffen en fatsoen vermaakt en gerepareerd te hebben de tafelen van den oordelen ons lief heren, hangende in de kameren van de Rade daarmen dient. It probably concerns the large painting with the Last Judgment of East Brussels KMSKB that I could examine with a team during our research project on pre-Etienne panel painting under the direction of Cyril Stroatkit Irpa. According to Van Werveken and some other authors, it is the painting that was made by the Ghent painter Lieven van der Klitte in 1413, but not unanimously accepted in literature. We can tell that this painting indeed showed the presence of old restorations in several places, in particular as has been observed by Snijers and Veronne Verhagen during the restoration in the 50s. So after 1483, Augustin de Brune was paid to make a sketch of a lion, no further detail. He became Dean of the Painters Guild, and in 1485, he's paid for the design of heraldic pieces of the Archduke of Austria. Iten betaalt Augustin schilderen dat hij beworpen heeft de wapenen van mijn heren, ten hertogen van Oostenrijk. Also in 1486-7, a payment to de Brune was registered for heraldic pieces, and in 1487, he was paid for a painting made for the Church of the Holy Saviour for the altar of the Holy Ghost. Augustin de Brune left Ghent and became a Bruges citizen, enrolled in the Bruges Painters Guild in 1488. To conclude the last topic of our talk, we can formulate the hypothesis that Augustin de Brune, possibly a member of the Maags family, could have been the painter of the Ghent Calvary triptych, a task he undertook in 1484 or 1485 on the demand of the heirs of Laurens for the decoration of his chapel in the St. John's Church. This also brings up the idea we sustain that the predella and the triptych were made within a same campaign, but executed by different masters. Probably the predella was painted at a later moment when the triptych was already finished. So we look forward to the interesting lecture to come up on the topic tomorrow. And after all these enumerations of years and named and archival stuff, a lot to listen at the end of the day. I would like really to thank you for your attention.
So thank you. Thank you, Dominic. Oh, it's really difficult to sum up. It's such an interesting afternoon, starting with Paula resume, so clear and keen and interesting. I appreciate it so much in the IRR. I haven't seen them before, the new, quite new. We are waiting for other news. And then Tommaso approach that allow us to delve into the Federico's court, not in a superficial way, because we know so well, especially the role of Federico and Ottaviano. We discuss so much about this, and you provide us so much bibliography and other interesting ideas. And then Stephen, considerations about the similarities, or better, the differences with Hugo van der Goes. And then Bart with his excursus, so interesting, and this passionate, where is Bart? I've lost, oh, okay. This passionate excursus on the helmets. I find it interesting. You keep this for me. I never know it before. And especially it's interesting that lead us to a different date for a possible different date for datation for the triptych. And then Dominic so well documented the information both on the commissions of the triptych and the attribution. And I find always interesting this comparison with Bottacin in Brussels that I found very similar. And then these fascinating similarities with Van Eyck for the triptych in Gand. And so many stuff. So I ask you if you have some questions for our speakers today. Or who want to begin? Thomas. Maybe I can ask Alessandro. Okay, you can. I switch this off. Okay. Yes. Oh, I think there were, maybe it was a little difficult to.
Yes, Paul, I have a question for you, actually. Thank you very much for your text that I received also in time, and very helpful indeed to encapsulate the whole problem here with the Justus group. I have two questions, actually. It's a bit nitty-gritty, but I couldn't follow why this blessing prize in Cadeau is being attributed to the group?
I think I should pass that one on to Francesca, because you've actually made this suggestion in your monograph.
Yes, but I think that's.
In the Calvary, not the Calvary, sorry, not
No,
the Calvary,
the blessing rising. Oh,
Yeah, it was an attribution during the 70s of some scholars from Venice. And I found it interesting. Then Caterina Liventani Virdis changed her mind, but we never agreed on so many attributions. But no, it's true. We were fighting usually. What can I say? The problem with the Christ of Cadoro is that we really don't know from where it comes. So this is the difficulties, because they say it was in a church in Padova in the 18th century, but it's really difficult to prove it. So we have old inventories on this, but it's really difficult to prove it. So I made this suggestion because of the scripta in the B1 book of the Confraternity of a Corpus Domini. So it was interesting, and also based on similarity, on stylistic similarities, but we have not so many evidences. So
yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Second question. The famous man, are there X-rays available for that? Because it's really hard to see that there is later interference in the pictorial layers. So it would be good to have X-rays.
Yeah, I'm not sure. We need someone from Paris who might be able to help us with that.
Yes,
But
of
certainly I went last month to have a look through the dossier, and I couldn't see that there was certainly nothing, there were no photographs of X-rays there.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I agree. It would be really, really helpful. And in that paper, I was just really trying to set things out as, trying to be as objective as possible. So things like the blessing Christ, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So much technical evidence that I'm sure, is probably there if one were able to delve into the the sort of deep files of the C2RMF. I don't know, but it would be great.
Okay, thank you very much.
No.
I think maybe Thomas.
Does that work?
Yes.
Does that work? Good. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for a very, very interesting afternoon. It was very enjoyable and very, very stimulating. And as you might expect, I want to focus on Bart's talk, which was really, really good. I thought very interesting and very original with lots of new information. And I do agree with you about the close dating of the predella and the triptych. And so tomorrow I hope to even add some data, some information to that will corroborate your thesis. More problematic for me, and also literally personally for me, as well as scholarship in general, is expertise on the armor.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not an expert on armor, and no one should necessarily believe what I have to say about it. But I thought actually that might be a way into, and I read the Guy article, and he is really one of the great, my understanding is he's one of the great scholars of armor of his generation, and still widely admired and respected. However, that article was published about 50 years ago. And trying to sort of get a lead on this, I contacted, at Marion's recommendation, actually, Don LaRocca at the Metropolitan Museum, who recently retired as an expert. And who works actually in this period. And we actually had a number of conversations and a number of email exchanges where I tried to go over, individual pieces of armor in the same way that you do. And tried to tease it out as best as I can. And his conclusion was that the predella should be painted dated between 1460 and 1480, and not later. And he thought, as he said, he's an admirer of Gaer, but he just thinks there's more information available now, and based on the the comparisons that he knows, that actually thinks the earlier date applies. So I'm just passing that along. That's kind of what I have. I'm not an expert, but I guess there'll be just so many things we can disagree on.
Okay, thank you very much for this suggestion. I'm curious to know what his arguments are. I'm not a specialist neither. I just dive into the material, what has been written, what is the bibliography. But the huge advantage with studying armory is that there are many plates that are dated. I consulted also Ronald van Belle, who has made many, how are they called? Sorry? Yeah, the frottis. And so these are represented, and that helps us a bit further in dating this armor. So, but
yes, custom studies, right? Yeah, it's a tough one. I admit that. And obviously, I want to believe my guy.
Yeah.
But actually, it might be a good idea to have a conversation. I had a extensive note from him, and there were definitely questions that he answered, where even at the end of the day, I didn't quite get it.
Okay.
Maybe together we can see what
Okay, yeah, definitely do that. Thank you.
Oh, actually, can I just say one other thing, which is, again, because I'm skeptical of the later dating, is it possible that those outdoor wings, which are complete wrecks, which I have had a terrible time linking either to the triptych or the predella, is it possible that the exterior wings are actually in the lake? And not by the artist, not by either of those.
This has often been suggested, indeed, in the literature. They are in a very bad state of conservation. In terms of style, I think it fits within the style of the figure types and the facial expression in this. But the whole thing? Yes. Yeah, it's obvious. It's obvious.
May I add something? Sorry, Tom, may I add something concerning the armor? I mean, Bart showed this helmet made for Maximilian in the 1490s, and that was, of course, the dernier cri for Maximilian. That was certainly the latest fashion. So these helmets with the rings in the neck, they existed in the 90s. And so I think it's hard to say that the armor shows a development before 1480. I mean, you cannot say it cannot be later than 1480 when you have objects depicted that were fashionable in the 90s. That is one thing. And the other one, I mean, you addressed the figures, the painted sculptures on the outside. And I must say, I also found it very hard to assess them in any way because they are so extremely damaged. However, what I mentioned, and I think I didn't draw the conclusion at the end because of lack of time. I mean, this aerial perspective that is used at the central panel of the Demar triptych, the fading of colors. I mean, it's interesting for me that it appears on the right-hand side wing of Hugo van der Goes' Portinari triptych in a similar way, and then with Art van den Bosche, but for example, not in the Monforte altarpiece. There you have a distant vista, but it does not have that kind of perspective. So either it was made in that triptych long before Hugo van der Goes came to use it, or it was a certain development that maybe was started by Hugo or somebody else, and then it must have appeared in the late 70s or 80s.
I'll talk about that tomorrow. I mean, and I'll have some examples.
Okay,
I think I agree with you that it's a key point for dating, and I think there's pretty good evidence that you can do.
I mean, yeah, I know you've shown several things in manuscript painting already, yeah, and that is true, even the changeant. Nevertheless, it does not occur very often in panel painting, at least.
Agreed. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah, I just want to add something about, there's a specialist of armor in the Wallace collection, Toby Capwell. I think it might be interesting to see what he thinks. I was in contact with him about the Ghent altarpiece also, because he came, he was very interested in that armor too. And I think, yeah. That's all I had to say.
Thank you. Fernando.
Good afternoon. My name is Fernando Marias, and I want to thank every and of the related speakers of this wonderful afternoon. I have a question for Madame Deneuve. From your new attribution, we should, I'm wondering, we need to look for another Maestro Solemne, whom Federico da Montefeltro agents in Ghent was asking for coming to Urbino, because I'm afraid that Brun had any important previous work to be asked for, painting for the Duke of Urbino.
Sorry.
De Bruyne, it's just a name that I came across when I examined the Ghent archives. Many painters are there, so I looked for, I tried to make an inventory and to see, and I came up with that name. And as I did research on Laurens de Maar, and so it was a bit, the same name, can I see? But of course, this artist has nothing to do with Urbino. It was an artist who worked there, so someone from the family, who made this altarpiece, really for the family and inspired by the Ghent altarpiece, because their chapel was far away. So, and this artist is difficult to situate because he's taking elements from composition elements, and then but a lot from the Ghent altarpiece. Why did he take this format? There's no reason to take to take that format. He took it. So, but this De Bruyne has nothing to do with Urbino.
But also, sorry if I can add, also with Joos van Wassenhove, we are dealing just with the name. I mean, okay, we know that he was friend with Hugo van der Hoes, and
that he was a friend.
Yeah, maybe.
Not even that.
Not even that. They know each other.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's it. So no paintings could be related to Joos van Wassenhove either. So in fact, as many other scholars, I was suggesting that maybe Federico asked for someone like Thierry Bouts at the beginning, and then because Thierry Bouts wasn't available, some other painter went to Urbino, but it's the same. Just Joos van Wassenhove is a name. We have no paintings. No. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question. I think both for Paola Nuttall and also for Tommaso. I think it was very interesting to hear you both lectures, one after the other. And in the notes I took during your talk, Paola, there was one sentence where I put an exclamation mark, which is when you said, it is possible that the Duke of Montefeltro was more interested in Flemish technique than in Flemish style. And I wonder, how is that possible? How could an Italian be looking for a Flemish painter and not being interested in his style, but just in his technique and distinguishing these two? That's one question. I don't know if Tommaso can link this with the personality of the Duke of Montefeltro. Would this fit into the way of dealing with art, seeing it as something technical or something aesthetical? I don't know if you can both react on that idea.
I'll go first, seeing as that was the first question. Yeah, I know. I mean, that was a kind of, it was a contentious statement that I threw out there, but it did. I'm basically drawing on what we know from I mean, maybe I'm taking Vespasiano too literally, this thing about, Federico wanted a painter who could work in oil. And that's what he got. But what we don't know is to what extent did he actually like Netherlandish style? And I'm kind of arguing against myself here as somebody who has devoted my life to arguing that the Italians in the 15th century loved Netherlandish painting. Well, they did, but they loved certain aspects of it. And if you read generally what contemporary commentators say about Netherlandish painting, people like Fazio, for example, most famous, or Ciriaco d'Ancona, or whoever, they mention certain things. And what they mention preeminently is the extraordinary facture of these paintings, what you can do with the oil medium. This is tricky, but this was something that they could see in these paintings from Van Eyck onwards, that they were not seeing to that extent, at least in the work of contemporary Italian painters up until towards the end of the 15th century. Just the ability to imitate light effects, textures, aerial recession, all of those things that you can do with oil. And they obviously got that oil is one of the ways forward here, because you have Filarete writing in Milan in the 1460s about oil painting, and it's great, è bello, chi lo sa fare, so there is this, I think, kind of mystique attached to oil painting. And I think Federico, who certainly knew Netherlandish oil paintings, I mean, there is the famous Van Eyck women bathing at Urbino that belonged to Ottaviano. He knows what these things look like. He has friends like Alfonso of Aragon, who owns these things, the Medici. He knows what these things look like, but he sort of gets that, it's down to the oil. This is the special secret, to use the word that Vasari later uses, the secret of oil painting. At the same time, sorry, this is turning into a long answer, but it's a big, important question. At the same time, as well as clearly admiring the oil technique, you can extrapolate from texts of people like Fazio, Ciriaco d'Ancona, that they admire also certain traits of Netherlandish painting, like the ability to paint these wonderfully naturalistic landscapes, like the skill in portraiture, we know, which Netherlandish painters are so famous for, and the sort of piety, the sort of devotional, sort of expressive, affective piety. These are things that we know the Italians like. These are things that we know the Italians imitated when they are imitating Netherlandish painting, whether you're Bellini or whether you're Leonardo da Vinci or Pollaiolo or Antonello or whoever. But actually style. And when I'm thinking style, I'm thinking of these, for example, these very sort of typical sort of clusters of Netherlandish drapery folds, or facial types, or poses, that they don't necessarily imitate those particular facets of Netherlandish painting. They interpret, they take what they want, they take from it, be it technique, be it a sort of portrait format, and then they kind of translate it into their own vocabulary, so that, you don't get Leonardo looking like Roger van der Weyden, even though he must have looked at Roger van der Weyden, and so on. So I think that's really what I was trying to say. And in fact, I could have said one other thing, but I was very conscious of time, and I already had so much to say, and there was so much ground to cover in that paper. But one thing that I would have liked to have said more about, and indeed I will in the proceedings, is this thing about, what was it that Federico really liked? And I think one of the things he really liked was portraiture. Coming back to that point of Netherlandish painters are admired for their skill in portraiture, because practically everything that we have from Justus in Urbino, assuming it's him, involves a portrait, whether it's an actual person or an imagined portrait of a famous man, or in the liberal arts. So yeah, okay.
Yeah,
you may.
just a very. Oh,
But
sorry.
Tommaso.
Sorry.
Just few words, because I really can't answer a question like that. Can we distinguish technique from art? It's a philosophical question. I can say that if we have an idea of the Renaissance made especially by Burckhardt, no, in that case we have an idea of the man of Renaissance that is a complete, a whole, an entirety. So we cannot distinguish anything. Techne, art, and philosophy are all together. And this is probably the case of Federico da Montefeltro, because he was very, very interested into technique. I don't mean, I refer, for example, to the military technique. When you find into the court Francesco di Giorgio Martini, together with Fra Carnevale, together with Scirro da Casteldurante, it's not because they are painters, but because they are engineers, military engineers. They build fortresses. So they are more related to the bombards than to a painting. But and also the cryptography is the same thing related to writings. You can have I don't know, something written, very well written, the chancellor, chancery letters, but we have also the cryptographic letters that explain a technique and the study of a new technique that we are studying now. And this is very similar with the idea of use a new technique for military arms. So my first idea would that you cannot distinguish. So if he calls in Italy, if he calls in Urbino Giusto di Gand, he does also because he is interested in both the things. Yes. Yes. One for the message. No. No. And that is the other big question. Now I just said, oh, we would like very much to know who were at Ottaviano's court, because we don't find artists seated into the Federico's court. We find the soldiers, more the soldiers than the artists. But somewhere you had to find those artists. Who knows? Probably in a small court of Ottaviano, you should find them. For example, yes, but for me, it's really weird, strange, not to find Piero della Francesca seated into the court, but you don't find him.
Something, Stefan?
Yeah.
Maybe.
To
Okay.
add something, and I'm completely with you. I think the distinction between technique and art, that's anachronistic for the time, because they did not even have terms for style or something like that. And if you look at descriptions, even from the 16th century, or the difficulties that Dürer had in describing that work is good, he just said, oh, it's wonderful, it's fantastic, it's good. And that's all that he can say.
You can distinguish technique and mind and philosophy.
Yes, but not as an artist. But what I wanted to add is, I mean, we have this Madonna, the Virgin by Piero della Francesca, painted for Federico at the Brera, and you see the armor of the Duke kneeling. And this is clearly, Montefeltro. And this is clearly an attempt to emulate the Netherlandish way to paint shining armor with the help of tempera painting. Therefore, it's rather dry. Or it's oil, but it is really oil. Okay, sorry. I always took it for tempera because it looks like tempera, actually. Well, it is so dry.
Mixed technique.
Mixed technique. Okay.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on a point that Tommaso made, and in fact, something that struck me when you were giving your wonderful paper. I love the idea of the people whose job it was to escort women to parties. But that wasn't what I wanted to ask you about. It was, have always assumed, because of Fernando Marias's document, in which, you know, you found Pietro Espagnolos living in the palace. So I've always assumed that, oh, therefore he must have been part of Federico's household. But you're saying that artists aren't actually sort of listed amongst the members of his household. So I'm just throwing this question at you. What if someone is living in the palace, what does that make them? What does that mean? Or might he in fact have been part of somebody else's household then, Pietro Spagnolos? È chiaro?
There is no on Piero Spagnolo. To our Palace of Director. So I don't, it's difficult.
Was he part of the household? I don't know, probably not. A member of the household had a salary, a fixed salary. Also, even if he was a nobleman. So perhaps there is a shadow part, a most opaque part around the core of the household. The dark palace. No, I wouldn't say that. But the position of artists, it remain something not clear, because it's not well recorded. So it's not the first thing that a courtier remembers. That's the question, not because they were not at court, but because nobody remembers or give them a position. The thing about escorting women to parties, yes, it existed until at least the end of 18th century. In Italian, they were called braccieri, because they gave the arm to the lady. And the ladies were escorted to parties. And as you listen to me, the man that was into the female part of the household were old and government men. Now, in other parts of the world, they were eunuchs. In Italy, they were just old.
Very tough.
It's enough.
I think we can go to the party. Can you...
Okay. I give you my arm. Yes, I'm older enough.